This is Atomic Shinobi and today I am going to narrate first part of what if Naruto was the son of Yami. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Zazie replied, looking in Naruto. Yeah, it is. He said, but this time I will kill him. I won't let him hurt my precious people. Zazie asked. Naruto nodded and Zazie smiled. She leaned in and captured his lips. Naruto was once again caught off but didn't mind it. As they pulled away from each other, he gave her a smile. Give me a warning next time, he said with a laugh. You can't just kiss me whenever you like. Zazie said with a pouting. Naruto smiled and pulled her close. I know that. She looked at him and smiled. Okay. I take you on a date when we get back happy. Naruto said to her. Zazie smiled at this and nodded. Good. He let go of her and sat up and gave her a serious look. The teme is going down. Next day Naruto had sent Zazie to bed a few minutes later so he could set up barrier tags all around camp. After he made sure everything was in place and that the battle wouldn't affect the girls in any way, he finally went to sleep. He woke up a few hours later to the smell of cooking. He noticed that he was starving. He hadn't eaten in a day and a half. He got up and headed towards the smell. He woke up to the sight of the class preparing breakfast, and as he watched everyone having fun, he couldn't help but smile. They were a good bunch and he was going to keep them safe from any threat, even if he died in the process. He made sure everyone was having a good time before waving for Zazie to follow him in the forest. Zazie noticed it and complied. Nodoka watched as they left and followed to see what was going on between them. Naruto stood in the trees and let out a strained sigh. He had been worried all night about Ayaka but knew that Sasuke wouldn't do anything to her until they faced each other. Zazie walked up beside him and saw he was in deep thought. She put a reassuring hand on his shoulder and he gave her a small smile. Zazie said, giving him a small smile. Thanks Zazie, he said, causing the girl to blush a little. Zazie said, giving him a worried look. I really don't know, Naruto answered and gave a sad sigh. He knew that Sasuke would use Ayaka to keep him from attack and he knew he would comply. He was stuck and couldn't think of what to do. Zazie looked at him and saw his worry. She unwrapped her neck and pointed to her tattoo. She said with certainty. Thanks Zazie, he said with a smile. Zazie asked him. Naruto smiled and leaned in, whispering something into her ear. Zazie blushed at this but listened carefully. As he pulled back, Zazie pulled him close and kissed him again. She couldn't help herself, she wanted to taste him. Naruto kissed her back. As they shared this moment together, they failed to notice Nodoka watching them. Nodoka watched them kiss and felt her heart break. She stood frozen in place, and she saw her love kissing another. She couldn't take it. He was lost to her. All she wanted to do was run away and cry, but she didn't want to alert the pair. She waited for them to leave before running deeper into the forest to cry. Ayaka couldn't feel her wrist as they waited for Naruto to show up. She watched her capture with hatred. He was a vile person who didn't care for anyone but himself. He was the complete opposite of Naruto. Naruto was caring, funny, clumsy, but he always cared for others no matter what. He would put his life on the line for others. Sasuke, on the other hand, was wanting nothing more than revenge. He was cold, uncaring and most of all arrogant. His not coming, Ayaka said as she watched Sasuke look around for Naruto. She thought that he would put the safety of the others over herself. Sasuke looked at her for a moment then laughed. Trust me, the Dobi will be here, he said, and soon a rustling could be heard from the tree line across the way. Naruto came walking out. He looked to be fully healed and ready to go. Hello Dobi, glad you could join us, Sasuke said sarcastically and stared at his hated foe. Naruto looked at Sasuke and gave him an angry look. I'm the one you want, let the girl go, Naruto said. I'm sorry but I cannot, Sasuke said as he drew his sword. She is here to make sure you don't run off. I never run, Naruto said and drew his side. Sasuke smiled at this and attacked. Naruto blocked his sword strike and counter with a punch to the chest, which Sasuke dodged. Naruto brought his scythe into an upward slash followed by a kick. Sasuke dodged the slash and used the kick to throw Naruto off balance. He tried to punch Naruto in the side only to have his fist connect with the scythe pole. Naruto was pushed back by this, but the attack hurt Sasuke more. As Sasuke continued to attack, he began to move faster and faster. Naruto in turn speed up as well. Soon they became a blur of colors. They disengaged each other for a moment before attacking again. Sasuke was getting tired of this combat, knowing that they were to evenly match. He jumped back and went through a few hand signs. Kaden, giant fireball, he shouted and sent a huge ball of fire from his mouth at Naruto. Naruto dodged to the side and was doing his own set of hand signs. Futon, wind blades, he shouted and sent the invisible blades of winds at Sasuke. Sasuke counter with Kaden. Fire bullets, he sent 5 medium-sized fireballs at Naruto, which were cut in half by the wind blades. As the attacks cancelled each other out, Naruto created a few cage bushes and set them after Sasuke. Sasuke fought the clones while Naruto raced towards Ayaka. Sasuke saw this and quickly detached the clones and ran after Naruto. Naruto was nearly to Ayaka when Sasuke knocked him to the side. He stood in front of his captive and smiled, looking over at Naruto. "That won't do," Sasuke said, and made a few hand signs, causing the ropes that bound Ayaka to tighten. Ayaka felt her breath leave her body and was having further trouble breathing. "If you want her to survive, I advise you not to try that again," Sasuke said before stopping the ropes. Naruto looked upon him with anger and attack. Sasuke smiled, getting exactly what he wanted, an angry Naruto. Naruto attacked wildly and Sasuke easily dodged these attacks. Naruto pressed his attack but nothing seemed to land. Sasuke, seeing opening, attacked by punching Naruto in the face. Naruto fell back and continued his attack. Ayaka watched as Naruto was blinded with anger and made stupid mistakes, but she also noticed that he seemed to hiding something. He was pushing Sasuke further and further from where she was tied. She suddenly heard someone whisper, "Anata no Maho o Hirageru, Kyasuda, spread you magic, caster," and saw Zazie land in front of her wearing her stage outfit from the Nightmare Circus. But the big thing that stood out to Ayaka was the large 10-tailed fox on her neck. Zazie gave her a smile before summoning a kunai out of the air, cutting her from her ropes. Zazie looked at Ayaka and pointed towards the tree line. Ayaka understood what Zazie wanted and ran. Zazie watched as Ayaka fled towards the trees and turned her attention to the two combatants. She pointed 2 fingers at Sasuke and said. A bolt of pale blue lighting shot out of her fingertips and towards Sasuke. Naruto jumped back when he heard Zazie say the Hado. Sasuke only warning was when the attack was speeding towards him. He dodged out of the way and looked to see who launched the attack. He saw a girl wearing a weird but sexy jester outfit, and it was the one who he killed earlier. He then noticed the golden fox on her neck. "So you formed a pact," Sasuke said, looking at Zazie with disgust. Naruto didn't answer and pressed his attack, but he suddenly jumped out of the way so that another bolt of lightning was shot at Sasuke. Soon Naruto and Zazie were comboing their attacks. He would press Sasuke with taijutsu and weapons, and Zazie launched his silent kiddos. Sasuke soon saw that he was at a disadvantage but continued to try and kill Naruto. But every time he got close, the damn girl would send a spell at him. He never heard a word come from her mouth, so he couldn't tell where she was going to fire from next. He waited for the next strike only to have Naruto come up and try to take his head off. "Damn it," Sasuke said as he ducked to dodge the strike only to be kicked in the face. He rolled on the ground and got up. He looked to see if he had his trump card still in play and saw Ayaka was gone. "Damn," he said and began to go through some hand signs. "Kaden. Extreme fire wave," he shouted, and out of his mouth came 10-foot tall wave of fire. He sent it towards Naruto and Zazie. Naruto watched as the wave of fire came towards him and did the only thing he could think of to stop it. "Sweden. Water wall." He shouted and created a huge wall of water. Zazie watched this and did the same. As the two attacks battled against each other, the fire lost, causing the water to turn to steam. "Futon. Great breakthrough," Naruto said and pushed the steam away. He and Zazie looked around for Sasuke and saw that he had run. "Damn him," Naruto thought as he looked around the battlefield. There were craters everywhere and the tree line was pushed back a few feet in some places. "Ayaka," Naruto shouted and looked around for her. Ayaka heard her name and peeked out from her hiding spot to see Naruto and Zazie standing a few feet away. She got up and ran towards them. She reached them and wrapped herself around Naruto and started to cry. "I was so scared," she said through her tears as Naruto put his arm around her, trying to keep her calm. Zazie watched with a hint of jealousy, but it quickly went away and was replaced with concern for her friend. Ayaka stayed in Naruto's arms for a few minutes before she felt safe. Naruto looked at her and was glad she was okay. "You ready to go?" he asked her, and Ayaka nodded. Naruto started to walk back towards his campsite with both Zazie and Ayaka in tow, but the funny thing was Ayaka would let go of his arm. As they walked towards camp, they didn't notice a specter watching their every move. Nodoka watched them leave and was shocked by what she had watched. Naruto had done things no human could do, and Zazie as well. She watched them save Ayaka and began to wonder who or what Naruto was. She wanted to know, but also she wanted to know how she could be like Zazie so she could be with Naruto. "I will keep trying," she said to herself as she filled with confidence. Naruto, Zazie, and Ayaka walked into camp and into the arms of their worried peers. As they walked up, Ayaka held her arm in pain and gave Naruto a dirty look. Flashback: before arriving at camp, Naruto stopped and sighed. He remembered what he told the class, and if Ayaka came back without some form on injury, they would get suspicious. "Hey Ayaka, can you stop for a minute?" Naruto said and watched her comply. Ayaka looked at Naruto wondering what he wanted. "Yes Naruto? I apologizing in advance for this, but we need to keep our stories the same," he said to her. Ayaka looked at him confused but suddenly understood when he grabbed her arm and put some pressure. A loud snap rang out and Ayaka tried to scream out in pain, but Zazie came over and covered her mouth. Ayaka looked at Naruto with a murderous glare before saying, "Why in the name of Kami did you do that?" She tried to hit him but she was in too much pain. "I told everyone you had gotten hurt in the fall and so I need to make you hurt," he said to her, and that was the fastest way. End of flashback. Ayaka knew that he was right, but he could have broken her arm a little more gently. Fortunately, she did not have time to think about it as the others rushed her over to Shizuna. Naruto watched as the rest of the class fawned over their hurt friend and smiled. He had saved her, but Sasuke had gotten away, and one thing Naruto knew about Sasuke is he didn't give up ever. "This is going to get dangerous," he said to himself before heading towards his tent to take a well-deserved nap. Nodoka sat by her friends and watched Naruto. He was hanging towards the back as everyone was fawning over Ayaka. She wondered what he was planning, but she was wondering what she would do to get him to notice her. Yu saw her friend in deep thought and looking at Naruto. She wondered what Nodoka was thinking and what she could do to help her friend. "Hey Nodoka, are you okay?" Yu asked Nodoka, who jumped at the sudden question. I'm fine," Nodoka said as she turned to look at her friend, as she held back her tears. Yu gave her an exasperated look and replied, "No you're not." Nodoka looked at her friend and started to cry. "I saw Zazie kissing him," she said, and Yu pulled her into a hug. Nodoka cried silently into her friends. Her heart was in so much pain. Yu stroked her hair and waited for her to calm down. Nodoka cried for a few more minutes before calming down. Yu looked at her friend and said, "What happened?" Nodoka proceeded to tell Yu what had happened but left out the rescue of Ayaka. Yu nodded as she listened to Nodoka's story and felt bad for her friend, but as she listened, she felt a glimmer of hope for her. So it was Zazie who kissed Naruto and not the other way around? Yu asked, making sure her assessment was right. Nodoka just nodded and Yu smiled. "Then you still have a chance," Yu said as Nodoka looked at her with a confused look on her face. Yu looked at her friend and shook her head before explaining it to her friend. Zazie was the one who kissed Naruto, not the other way around, which means she likes him, but he has yet to give her an answer. Nodoka looked at Yu with joy. She still had a chance. Yu was happy she could help her friend and leaned in close. "Now hear what we are going to do." Ayaka lay in the tent the other had prepared for her and grumbled. "Stupid Naruto," she mumbled to herself as she lay on her sleeping bag. She was glad to be safe but would have rather he had not broken her arm. As she lay there, she thought back to battle and wondered what else Naruto was hiding. He was a Shinigami's soul reaper, someone who took people's soul, yet he wasn't a bad person like all the legends and stories say. "Well, his is different," she said and began to list off all high straight in her head. "He is nice, caring, smart, funny, strong, handsome." Wait, what? She stopped herself. Did I just call him handsome? Why did I call him handsome? As she mentally debated with herself, Naruto had entered the tent and was now standing over her. "Ayaka," he said to get the girl attention, but she seemed to notice. "Earth to Ayaka?" Ayaka heard this and looked up to see the person who occupied her thoughts standing over her. She blushed and tried to hide it. "What do you want?" she said, trying to sound mad. "Just wondering if you were okay after all that happened?" he asked her as he sat down, his voice filled with concern. "Yeah, I think," she responded, not sure of herself. Naruto looked at her and said, "You want to talk about it?" Ayaka was about to say no, but stopped herself. She really wanted to talk about what had happened and Naruto was the best person to talk to. She just nodded and Naruto started to make himself comfortable. Ayaka looked at him and smiled a little. He was a good person, always wanting to help even if he did like to destroy others' property while doing it. "I was scared," she finally said as she remembered what happened. "I was tied up and helpless. I couldn't stop him if he wanted to rape me," she said as her eyes began to tear up. "I thought I never get to see anyone I cared for again. I was so scared." She cried and Naruto wrapped her up in his arm, letting her cry it out. Once again, he knew it was his fault that he let her be taken and he was making damn sure it wouldn't happen again. Ayaka cried for a few more minutes before speaking again. "When we were waiting for you to show, I thought you would not going to show. I thought you would put the safety of the others before me, but when you walked out of the woods I was so happy." Naruto looked down at the crying girl and smiled at her. "I never leave as precious person behind," he said to her. "I am precious person," Ayaka said with a bit of surprise. "Of course you are," Naruto replied as if she was being dumb. "You, Zazie, Nodoka and everyone in the class are precious to me." When I first took this job I thought I was going to hate it, but after spending time with you I came to realize I am happy to be here. Thank you, Ayaka said and hugged him back. You welcome, he answered her and stroked her hair. As the sun rose on the next day, Naruto got out of his tent and stretched. Everyone was safe and happy. Also, he did not have anyone trying to kill him at the time. He headed down to the lake and let the morning breeze flow across his skin. He knew that today was going to be a good day. He didn't notice his favorite acrobat getting up. Zazie noticed him standing near the edge of the lake and walked over to him. She tapped him on the shoulder and he jumped, falling into the lake. Cold, he shouted as he jumped out of the lake and back onto the shore. All the while Zazie just stood there giggling. Naruto stuck his tongue out at her and got off the ground. Zazie said with a giggle. Glad you enjoyed it, Naruto said, then gave her an evil smile. Zazie saw this and tried to get away, but Naruto already had her in his arms running towards the water. Banzai! Naruto shouted and jumped while Zazie let out a silent scream. Soon a splash of water and laughter filled the air. Zazie swam to the surface and gave Naruto a dirty look. Zazie said as she saw Naruto next to her. Naruto laughed and smiled, just enjoying the moment. Beautiful, he said, causing Zazie to blush. Zazie swam close to him and pulled him into a kiss. He smiled and kissed back as they floated in the water in each other's arms. It was later in the day after the swimming kiss, and Yu was putting her get Nodoka with Naruto plan into action. Step 1: get Naruto to notice Nodoka and no one else. She and Haruna had gotten Nodoka into a bikini that showed a lot of silky skin. Nodoka wore a light jacket to cover her body and looked at her friend with confusion. Are you sure this is going to work? She asked them, as she tried to pull the jacket down lower. Haruna smiled and gave her thumbs up. Of course, no man can resist hot girls in a bikini. Nodoka nodded but didn't take off the jacket, and the trio headed down towards the lake. They reached the lake to see most of the class in bikinis as well. The ones who stood out the most were Mana and Keed, which made Nodoka look at herself with sadness. Yu saw this and looked at Nodoka. It's fine, she reassured her friend as she looked around the shore for Naruto. She saw him sitting on the dock with Zazie and a few others. He was wearing a pair of black and orange board shorts while Zazie was wearing a silver two-piece with 10-tailed fox design. Nodoka and her friends walked over to the docks. Nodoka was getting very nervous with each passing steps. As they walked, they noticed Naruto performing tricks of the docks. He jumped high in the air and flipped 3 times before entering the water in a perfect dive. They watched and Nodoka drooled as he came out of the water. They watched the water run down his toned body, and with the light reflecting on the droplets it made him glow like a god. Nodoka just stood there in a daze for several minutes watching her crush. Yu waved her hand in Nodoka's face to see if she was in there, but sadly, she was not. She out of it, Yu said sadly, and they pulled the dazed girl towards her crush. Naruto and Zazie were enjoying their time at the lake. They were having a contest to see who could do the better tricks. So far they were dead even and both were not giving up. Zazie looked at Naruto and smiled. She walked to the beginning on the dock and then started to run. As she ran she started to add a front handspring to it. She reached the edge of the dock and launched herself high in the air. She flipped once before coming into a tight spin. She backed, flipped and straightened out, going into the water with a little splash. Naruto sighed as he watched this. Damn, he said to himself. Zazie got out of the water and Naruto blushed as he watched the water run down her lovely body. Zazie said with a small smile, and Naruto just sighed. You win, he said, and Zazie smiled and sat down at the edge. She patted the area beside her and Naruto sat down next to her. Zazie looked at him and said, You're the winner, he said. I have to do anything you want when we get back to Mahora. Zazie smiled and said, Great, Naruto said to himself as he dreaded what Zazie wanted from him when they got back. As they talked, the sound of footsteps filled the air and Naruto turned to see the library trio walking towards them. Yu and Haruna seemed to be dragging a dazed Nodoka over to them. Zazie watched this and frowned. She knew Nodoka had a crush on Naruto from her observation from class. She looked at Naruto and wanted him all to herself. As she thought about it, a plan formed in her mind. Nodoka was finally coming out of her daze when she noticed that they were near Naruto. She looked at his scared chest and fought back a large nosebleed. Naruto turned to look at her and smiled. Hi, he said with a smile, causing Nodoka to melt and Yu to smile a bit. Hi Naruto, Nodoka said, hiding her face behind her hair. Yu looked at her friend and inwardly sighed. She needs to be more aggressive, Yu thought, and quickly formed a plan to get Nodoka alone with the blonde. Haruna looked at Yu and saw the wheels in her mind turning, so she decided to run interference while she waited for a plan. So Naruto, how are you enjoying the trip? Haruna asked, hoping that Yu would come up with something soon. It's been good, he said as he looked out at the water. A few bumps in the beginning, but it going good now. That's great, Haruna said and continued the small talk, all the while Nodoka stood in the back too scared to get close. What's wrong with me? She thought to herself. Back at the Mahora she had approached him before, but she could do it now. Yu finished her thinking and smiled. I am sorry Nodoka, Yu said and pretended to trip over her feet, knocking Nodoka in the water. Nodoka wasn't prepared for this and hit the water. As she struggled to get to the surface, Naruto had already jumped in to help her. As he reached her and pulled her up, she couldn't help the blush coming onto her face. He was always there to help her. Are you okay? He asked with concern in his voice. Nodoka, not trusting her voice, simply nodded. They reached the dock and he let her get up first before he got on. Nodoka was complete soaked and her white jacket hugged her skin, revealing her bikini. Naruto saw this and blushed. Yu noticed this and decided to take advantage. She walked over to Nodoka and whispered in her ear. Nodoka blushed as she listened to her friend. Yu stood up, walked over to Naruto, and started a small conversation, drawing attention away from her friend. Nodoka was watching this and saw Zazie watching her. Nodoka, not wanting to lose Naruto to her, slowly unzipped her jacket and took it off. She let it fall to the ground and walked slowly over to Naruto. She moved her hair from her face and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned and turned beet red when he saw the beauty standing before him. She was wearing baby blue bikini that showed off her features well. She has a great body, Naruto thought as he looked at her. Nodoka was looking at Naruto and could see the blush on his face. She blushed as well and a silence fell between them. Yu sighed, walked behind her friend and gave her a small nudge. She fell into Naruto, who fell into the water with her on top of him. As they swam to the surface, Nodoka couldn't help her blush. Naruto on the other hand had gotten all hot and bothered. Therefore, he decided to stay in the water, not wanting the girls to see him in that state. Nodoka had gotten out of the water and noticed that Naruto was getting out. She leaned down. Naruto got a good view of her cleavage and sank deeper in the water. Are you okay? She asked him, and all he did was nod. Zazie watched this, was also wondering what was wrong with Naruto, and leaned down as well, causing Naruto to blush harder and sink deep into the water. Zazie asked with concern. Just want to take a swim, he said quickly and swam as fast as her could from the dock. Nodoka watched this with confusion while Zazie smiled. She knew what was wrong with Naruto once she saw her face. Yu also knew what was wrong with Naruto and was happy for her friend. If she can do that to him, then she has a chance, Yu said as she watched the blonde swim to the other side of the lake at amazing speeds. Naruto sat by the campfire inside. These damn girls are getting me all hot, he muttered to himself as he watched Nodoka and Zazie making dinner. He watched the girls and tried not to let his mind wander to him doing naughty things to him. Damn arrow. Senin, he muttered and turned away. Zazie watched this and smiled, a plan forming in her mind. As the night went on, she decided to put her plan in action. She sat down next to Naruto and leaned into him. Naruto blushed and froze. Zazie, what are you doing? He said. Zazie replied and Naruto was crying on the inside. What do you mean that you're tired? He pleaded as Zazie looked up at him. Zazie said with a pout. No, he said and she smiled. Zazie smiled and wrapped her arms around him. Everyone watched this and was surprised of how bold Zazie was being. Nodoka watched this with envy. Yu looked at her friend and nudged her point to Naruto other side. Nodoka blushed and shook her head no. You're going to lose him to her if you don't do anything, Yu said to her friend, and Nodoka was silent. She could argue with her line of thinking and just nodded. She stood up, sat down next to him, and did the same as Zazie. Naruto felt her next to her and tried not to blush. Oh, crap. Stay down, he pleaded as his body reacted to these. Zazie saw that Naruto was trying to keep himself in control and decided to take it up a notch. She wrapped her arms around his neck and snuggled close to him. Naruto was so red that he couldn't do anything. Everyone watched this as with interest. Zazie, the silent one, was snuggling close to Naruto, and so was the bookworm. This was not happening. They expected this from Kid and Haruna, but these two did not do this kind of things ever. Wow, was all Chisame could say as she watched the scene. Naruto looked at the girls and was lost in the bliss of being near them. It was finally time to head back to Mahora and everyone was ready to go. Naruto had to admit it started out crappy but turned out okay. It had started out good, then went downhill when Sasuke showed up, but after that, it turned out great. He had made a pact with a beautiful girl, saved another beautiful girl, and became rather close to yet another beautiful girl. Overall, he says it was a shaming success. Zazie smiled as she watched Naruto help load the bus for the ride back to school. She was quite happy with the trip. She had gotten closer to Naruto than any other girl had, and he even made a pact with her. She touched her neck and smiled as she felt the warmth coming from the tattoo. She couldn't wait to head back to Mahora and go on the date he had promised her. She remembered the promise that he made to her at the dock and was planning to use it to get very close to Naruto. Nodoka sat by her friends and couldn't help but smile. She had gotten closer to Naruto and she was hoping to get closer to him. Yu was happy for her friend and was already planning on get her closer to her crush. Ayaka stood with her arm in a sling. She was happy to be heading home but was kinda sad to leave. She had gotten to know Naruto better and wanted to get to know him more. He had saved her from Sasuke and was always concerned with her well-being. She watched him work and blushed. She was going to get to know him very well indeed. It had been a few days and Naruto was happy to be in a bed again. As he opened his eyes, he noticed something close to him. He turned and saw Nodoka lying next to him. It had become a recurring thing ever since the trip. Flashback. On the first night after the trip, Naruto was happy to be back in the room. He had gotten ready for bed and was now shirtless with pajama pants on. As he laid down to rest, he did not notice the girls watching him. Yu made sure that he was asleep before addressing Nodoka. "He right there, you need to make your move." Nodoka just blushed and shook her head. Yu face panned and tried to think of a way to get Nodoka out of her shell. "If you don't do this then no new books for a month," Yu said as she watched the horror shriek across her face. "You wouldn't," Nodoka said with shock. "Try me," Yu replied and pushed Nodoka towards the blonde. Nodoka tripped on her feet and fell but Naruto was already fast asleep. She turned her head back towards her friends and they gave her the backhand wave. Nodoka sighed and quietly walked over to Naruto. She watched him sleep and blushed deeply. He looked so peaceful to her. Naruto's arm was hanging off the side of his bed and as he turned he pulled Nodoka down on top of him. He felt her but he pulled her close to him as he locked his arms around her. Nodoka blushed deeply and made a small attempt to escape but to no avail. Therefore, with a smile she resigned herself to her fate. End of flashback. After that night she had willing snuck over to Naruto's bed and laid down. Naruto sighed as he looked at the sleeping girl next to him. She looked so peaceful and he couldn't deny that he was attracted to her. So he just laid back down and watched her sleep. Nodoka felt the sun hit her face and woke up slowly. As she came to, she noticed her favorite blonde lying next to her. She blushed but was happy that he was there. She looked at him and saw that he was awake. She was as red as a tomato. "Was he watching me sleep?" she thought as she looked into his eyes. He looked back at her and smiled. He leaned in close and said, "You are very cute when you sleep." Nodoka's brain overloaded at the comment and she proceeds to pass out from happiness. Naruto smiled at this and kissed her on the forehead before getting out of the bed. Naruto walked into the headmaster office with a smile. It had been a good morning for him and he felt it was going to be a good day. "Naruto, how are you?" Kano said as Naruto sat down in front of him. Naruto smiled and replied, "I am doing great, and the trip was a great success." Kano nodded and smiled. "I am glad you and the class enjoyed it," he said but paused for a moment before giving Naruto a serious expression, "but I would like to talk about the kidnapping incident." Naruto sighed inwardly and proceeded to explain what had transpired. Kano listened intently to what the young blonde was saying. He was worried at first but as he listened to the blonde's tale he knew that he made the right decision by hiring him. Naruto finished the story and waited for Kano to respond. Kano was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I am glad the matter was resolved," he said with a smile. "Now then, what do you think of my granddaughter?" Naruto looked at Kano and face panned. "I'm going now." But Kano tried to stop him but Naruto didn't pay him any mind. As he exited the office, he felt someone try to grab him from behind. His reflexes kicked in and as the person grabbed for him he ducked. Then grabbed the attacker's arm and flipped them into a wall. As he looked to see who his attacker was, he felt a familiar presence near him. "Chachimaru," he said as he turned to look at her. Chachimaru stood there and gave him a small smile, a touch of red on her cheek. "Hello Naruto," she said as she tried to hide her blush. "How have you been?" "Doing great, just dodged another feeding frenzy," he said with a laugh. Chachimaru looked at him confused and asked, "What makes you say that?" He looked at her and laughed to himself. "If you're here then the one lying at the base of the wall was Evangeline," he stated. Chachimaru simply nodded and Naruto started to walk away. She watched him and took as many pictures as she could. While he was away on the trip she had been thinking about what had transpired in the forest before he had left. He had hugged her and kissed her on the cheek, and then she kissed him on the mouth. She had run away before he could say or do anything so she had no idea what had happened next. As she picked up her unconscious master, she began to plan to get closer to the blonde. Not just for her master but for herself as well. Ayaka walked into the classroom and sat down. It had been a few days since the camping trip and class was back in session. She was quite happy to be back and was looking forward to spending time with a certain someone. Ever since they had gotten back, she hadn't managed to get closer to Naruto and was deeply frustrated. Why is one blonde so hard to find? She thought to herself as she waited for the others to get to class. Soon everyone came walking in and Negi was close behind. Negi had heard about the trip and was glad everyone had fun. He looked at Ayaka and hoped she had gotten closer to Naruto. He walked over to her and smiled. "How are you today, Ayaka?" he asked her with a smile. Ayaka looked at the younger boy and smiled. "I'm doing fine," she replied with a smile. All the while, she watched the door out of the corner of her eye. "That's great," Negi said. "So how was the camping trip?" Nodoka was silent for a moment as a small blush spread across her face. "It was fun," she said. "Well, I'm glad you had fun," he said. "Yeah," she replied when she saw Naruto walk through the door. She turned to Negi and said, "Nice talking to you, sensei." She got up and walked over to Naruto. "Morning, Naruto," she said with a smile. He smiled at her and replied, "I'm doing well." "That's great," she said with a smile. She looked him in the eyes and blushed. "Would you like to hang out later?" Naruto was caught off guard by this but simply shrugged it off. "Sure, I'm game," he said to her, making Ayaka smile. The bell rang and she said, "I see you after class." "It's a date," he said and walked towards his chair by the window. What he didn't notice was the way Ayaka acted at those words. A date," she mumbled and walked in a daze back to her seat. As the school day ended, Ayaka found Naruto standing by the fountain in the quad. He seemed at peace to her. She walked over to him and stood beside him. "Hi," she said, pulling him out of his musing. "Hey," he replied as he turned to look at her. He looked at her and tried not to blush. She was beautiful, the way her long blonde hair fell over her lovely form. Ayaka saw that he was staring and blushed. She turned to him and said, "Are we going somewhere or are you going to just stare?" Naruto smiled at her and said, "Of course we are." "Good, let's go," she said and pulled him along. They headed down the street until Ayaka stopped in front of a small restaurant. Naruto looked the place over and saw that it served French cuisine. "Come on," Ayaka said and entered the restaurant with Naruto close behind. They waited for a waiter to seat them, all the while an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Ayaka looked at Naruto and tried to say something but her voice wasn't working. "Why can't I say anything?" she mentally yelled at herself. She wanted to get to know Naruto, but here she was standing next to him like a timid rabbit. She was Ayaka Yukihiro. She could bring entire companies to their knees. She could talk to a boy. She was about to say something when Naruto said, "So where did you find this place?" Ayaka was glad he started the conversation and replied, "I found it last year before Negi became our teacher." "That's cool," Naruto replied, and they once again settled into the silence. A waiter came up and led them to a private booth. As they looked over the menus, Ayaka was trying to think of something to say to him once again. "So how have you been?" she finally said as she looked at him over her menu. Naruto didn't look up from his menu and replied, "I'm doing fine." "That's nice," she said as the silence once again settled between them. She watched him as they ordered their food and couldn't help but think what had happened in his life. After what happened on the trip, she knew that all the scars had very sad stories to go along with them. Yet she couldn't bring herself to say anything to him. Naruto was getting tired of all the silence between them, and as they waited for their food he said, "Is there something bothering you?" Ayaka looked at him and tried to wave it off. "Of course not," she replied, and she turned her head so he could look her in the eye. "Yes, there is," he stated, not liking how she dodged the question. Ayaka saw that she couldn't get him to drop it and sighed in defeat. She began but fell silent soon after. Naruto watched the girl closely and could see that she wanted to ask something but was too afraid to say anything. He shook his head and sighed. "It's okay, I won't get mad at you." "Really?" Ayaka said quietly and watched as smiled at her. "Of course not, I can't get mad at a beautiful girl like you," he said, causing Ayaka to blush. Ayaka, satisfied with this answer, was silent for a moment. She looked at him then asked, "What are you exactly?" Naruto was looking at the girl and laughed. "That's what you wanted to know," he said as he tried to stop laughing. Ayaka looked at him with anger but kept herself calm. "Yes, it is." "Why?" Naruto asked her, wondering her motivation behind the question. Ayaka was quiet for a few minutes before answering. "When I was captured by Sasuke, he showed me the battle that you and 9 others defeat him in," she said. "I have never seen anyone able to do that, so I wonder what are you?" Naruto could tell that she was sincere in her questioning. She really wanted to know what he was. He smiled at her and said, "Okay, I tell you." Ayaka looked at him thinking he would have told her no. "Really?" she said. "Yes, really," he said with a chuckle. "I am what you call a Shinigami, a soul reaper if you will. It is my job to collect dead souls and send them to the proper resting place. He then proceeded to explain everything he thought she needed to know. She would ask a question every now and again, but she mostly just listened. She was fascinated by his explanation. She never thought that there were people like Naruto going out into the world and helping souls. She watched as he explained and couldn't help but be glad that he was the one there for them. As they talked, their food came and went. Soon they were out the door and headed back to the dorms. Ayaka stood next to him as they walked with a slight blush on her face. "So is there anything else you would like to know?" he asked her as they walked. She thought for a moment before answering, "Not really." Naruto nodded and they walked in silence. They reached the dorms and Naruto walked her to her room. "Have a great night," he said to her and turned to leave when she grabbed her arm. "Wait," she said as Naruto turned to face her. "Yes?" he asked. She looked at him and blushed. "I was wondering if you would move back in with me," she said, catching Naruto off guard. "I was wrong earlier for kicking you out." Naruto stood in front of her in silence. Damn, he thought to himself. He was quite happy in his current residence but didn't know what to say to Ayaka. He kissed her on the cheek and smiled. "Let me sleep on it." Ayaka didn't hear him, stunned that he kissed her on the cheek. She stood outside her door frozen as Naruto walked away. Zazie watched Naruto from her desk and smiled. She couldn't wait to get him alone and make him hers. She was happy that she was the one that was closest to him. As she watched, she noticed 3 others looking at him. He already suspected Nodoka and Ayaka, but Chachimaru was new to her. She frowned as she watched her rivals look at her fox, she thought, and couldn't wait till the end of class. Naruto was not really paying attention to anyone as he debated within himself. Ayaka asked him to move back in with her last night, but he was currently rooming with Nodoka. As he debated with himself, he felt the pull of his pact. He turned towards Zazie and saw that she was looking at him. He could see in her eyes the longing. He smiled to himself and waited for class to end. As the bell rang, Naruto waited for everyone to leave and he appeared next to Zazie. He pulled her close and whispered in her ear, "Miss me?" Zazie wrapped her arms around his neck and leaned into him, answering. "Really now," he said with a smile. "Then shall we go?" Zazie nodded and they walked out of the room. Naruto led her to the base of the world tree only for him to pick her up bridal style and carry her to the top branches. She blushed as she was carried and leaned her head against his chest. To her this was heaven. They were together and that what mattered. Once they reached their destination, Naruto tried to put Zazie down but she wouldn't have it. She wrapped her arms around his neck and wouldn't let go. Naruto sighed in defeat and sat down with his back against the trunk of the tree. He formed a quick cage bushing and had to go get the picnic he made via another clone. The clone saluted and headed on his way, leaving the two alone. They sat and watched the day pass. Zazie looked at her Naruto and smiled. This is what she wanted. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked her as they sat there. Zazie looked at him and smiled. She replied, "That's great," he said to her and saw that the food had arrived. He was handed a basket and the clone dispelled. Zazie looked at basket in wonder and watched as Naruto pulled out an assortment of sandwiches and other foods. She looked at the food and took a sandwich. She took a smile bite and her face lit up in pure joy. She stated and finished the sandwich. Naruto smiled and picked up one. "Glad you like it," he said and started to bring the sandwich to his mouth when Zazie stopped him. She said with a sultry smile. She took the sandwich out of his hand and broke off a small piece. She commanded. Naruto complied and she fed the piece to him. Naruto smiled and noticed a little piece of the sandwich on her finger, so he leaned in and licked it off. Zazie blushed at this and Naruto took another sandwich and broke a piece off. "Your turn," he said with a smile. They fed each other all the food and after everything was gone, Zazie leaned in and kissed back and pulled her close. As the sun set, Zazie was happily lying in Naruto's arms around her. She broke the kiss and said, "Always," he said and kissed her. She smiled and broke the kiss. She said. Naruto kissed her once more and they stayed in each other's arm for a few more minutes before they proceed back to the dorms. They walked hand in hand but soon detangled as they neared their destination. Naruto smiled as he walked Zazie to her door. "I see you later," he said and turned to leave but Zazie stopped him. She said. "Yeah," he replied. She looked at him and smiled. "Yeah, I always keep my promises," he said and Zazie smiled grew. She said to him, making Naruto nervous. "And that is?" he asked, afraid of her answer. She said and pulled him into a kiss before going in her room. Naruto stood outside the door shocked. "I am so screwed," he said and walked back to his room. Naruto entered his room and sighed. He didn't know what he was going to do. Ayaka and Zazie both asked him to move in with them. He knew he would have to make a decision about this. He was happy rooming with Nodoka and the others but he did promise Zazie. He just sighed to himself and walked over to his clothes and began to pack. Nodoka saw this and walked over to him wondering what was going on. "Naruto, why are you packing?" she asked. "I tell you in the morning," Naruto said, brushing off the question. Nodoka tried to get it out of him, but he simply ignored her. As the night wore on, Nodoka became increasingly worried about what was going on. As she sat on her bed waiting for Naruto to fall asleep, she didn't notice him walk into the room and look at her. "Hey," he called, making the blue-haired girl jump a little. "Why? Yes," she stammered. "You coming or not?" he asked her. She gave him a puzzled look and he just sighed. He walked over to her, picked her up off the bed, and headed towards his. Nodoka, shocked by this, and just let him lay her down on the bed. He got in and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "That's better," he said, and turned to fall asleep. Nodoka just nodded, and then she heard him murmur, "I going to miss this." She was about to ask what he meant, but he was already asleep. She pulled him closer to her and hoped that this wasn't going to end. As the sun came through the window, Naruto didn't want to get up. He wasn't looking forward to telling Nodoka that he was moving out. He was getting very comfortable around her and didn't want it to end, but he did promise Zazie. Therefore, with a heavy heart, he got out of bed and finished packing his things. Nodoka woke up slowly and noticed that her big strong teddy bear was not there with her. She sat up and saw him packing all his things. "What's going on?" she said to him with worry. Naruto turned to her and she could look and see the sadness in his eyes. "I'm moving out," he stated, and went back to packing. "Why?" Nodoka asked, trying not to cry. Naruto didn't answer and kept on packing. "I'm sorry," he said, and left the room with bags in hand. Nodoka began to cry but ran after him. She saw him walk towards the school building and promised herself that she would find out why he was leaving. Naruto sat by his window and sighed. He did not have a good morning. He had left Nodoka without telling her why he was leaving. As the class came in, he noticed that Nodoka was walking over to him with a determined look on her face. "Oh crap," Naruto thought as Nodoka confronted him. "Why are you moving out?" she demanded, loud enough for everyone to hear. Before Naruto tried to explain, Ayaka walked over and butted in. "He moving back in with me," she said. She thought he was moving back in with her. Again Naruto opened his mouth to say something when Zazie butted in. She said to other girls with a big grin. "No, he is staying with me," Nodoka said, and pulled Naruto close to her. He was then pulled towards Ayaka. "No, he's staying with me," she shouted. Zazie pulled Naruto to her and locked her arms around him. She said only for the other girl to try to get Naruto from her. Soon Naruto was being pulled in 3 different directions. He tried to escape, but he couldn't get his hands together to pull off any justice. As this was going on, the rest of the class watched in awe. Asakura had her camera out and was taking as many pictures as possible to put in the paper. The 3 girls shocked Asuna and Negi. They have never seen them act like this ever. Kano walked into the class and watched what was going on. He chuckled to himself and thought that Naruto was a lucky guy. He wanted the fight to continue but came here for important business. "Stop this now," he said in his loudest voice, causing all 3 girls to freeze in their place. He pointed at them and said, "You're 4, follow me now." They all nodded and proceeded to leave the classroom right behind the headmaster. Everyone was silent for the longest time before Asuna said, "Wow." The girls and Naruto sat in front of Kano's desk in silence. Kano looked at the teens and couldn't help but sigh. It was obvious that Naruto cared for them deeply but couldn't choose between them, and no, they all wanted him to room with them, so he was stuck with this problem. "So let me get this straight, you were fighting over who Naruto was going to room with, correct?" he asked the girls, who simply nodded yes. Turning to look at Naruto, he said, "Did you choose who you want to room with?" Naruto shook his head. No. Kano sighed and rubbed his forehead, when an idea came to mind. "I have a solution," he said, getting their attention. They all looked at him and waited. Kano, glad to see they were paying attention, continued, "All you are going to room together." There was a few moments of silence before 2 girls said, "What?" and Zazie said. Meanwhile Naruto listened in a daze. Room with all 3. He was happy yet dreading what was going to happen. As 3 girls tried to talk at once, Kano held up his hand to silence them. "You 3 room together, win him or not room with him at all." The 3 girls nodded and he smiled. Now that is settled, he turned to Naruto. "Naruto." Naruto snapped out of his daze and said, "Yes?" "There is someone here to see you," Kano said with a knowing smile. "Oh Naruto," a voice said from behind them. Naruto turned and stood there stunned. "Mom." "Mom," Naruto said, causing the 3 girls standing next to him to turn and see whom she was. They watched in wonder as a woman in her late 20s to her earlier 30s walked towards them. She had long silver hair, sticking blue eyes, and a body that could make me drool and women jealous with envy. "My little boy," she said as she walked over to Naruto. "Hi Mom," Naruto said with a smile but was suddenly pulled into a bone-crushing hug. I miss you so much, she said as her son tried to breath. Can't breathe, he stammered as his began to turn blue. Yami quickly let go of her son and smiled, sorry force of habit. Naruto sighed, it's okay, he muttered and again pulled into another hug. Nodoka, Ayaka, and Zazie watched in awe. This woman gave birth to their crush and still looked smoking hot. Wow, was all Ayaka could say, and the other girls nodded. They watched the mother fuss over her son for a few more minutes. Kano watched this and tried not to laugh at the scene. Excuse me, he said, trying to get everyone to focus once again. Yami turned to Kano and gave him a serious stare. I'm trying to bond with my son, she said as she pulled Naruto close. I can see that, but, Kano said, but was cut off by Yami. I haven't seen him in a long time and I want to spend time with him, she said as Naruto began to turn blue again. Now butt out, she ordered, only to feel Naruto go limp. My baby, she cried and began to shake him. Are you sure they're related? Nodoka said as she saw Yami try to revive her son. Naruto slowly opened his eye and looked around. He saw the white walls and noticed the smell of disinfectant. Where am I? He said and looked around. He saw Ayaka sitting next to him. She watched him sit up and smiled. I am glad you're okay, she said to him. You passed out at the headmaster's office, so we brought you to the nurse office. Thanks, Naruto replied and held his head. I had the weirdest dream. What happened in your dream? Ayaka asked him. Naruto looked at her and laughed as he thought about it. I was dreaming that my mom was here and she was hugging me to death, he said with a laugh. Naruto, Ayaka said, getting his attention. Yeah? He asked. She looked at him with a serious look and said, that wasn't a dream? Naruto looked at Ayaka for a moment. You're joking, right? He said, hoping she was just pranking him, but that was soon shattered by the sound of the door opening and someone shouting, my baby. Naruto was once again being suffocated by his mother as she held him close. He flailed wildly and tapped her hard, trying to make her let go. He can't breathe, Ayaka shouted, causing Yami to let go of her son. Naruto breathed in deeply and was happy for the help. Yami looked at her son sheepishly. Sorry. Naruto looked at his mom and smiled. It's okay, you're just happy to see me. She hugged him once again but didn't crush him. I missed you so much, she said as she held him close. Me too, he said and hugged her back. They broke the hug and smiled at each other. So what brings you here? Naruto asked Yami as he got out of the bed. I can't just come visit my son whenever I want, Yami answered, trying to brush the question off. Mom, Naruto said, trying not to get annoyed. She looked at her son and smiled. I need a vacation, she stated. But what about? Naruto started to say, but Yami cut him off. It's fine, I have my most trusted assistant taking care of things, she said with a smile. Please don't tell me you just left a note and ran off, Naruto said, but Yami gave him a sheepish smile, causing him to sigh. In hell. Helios sat at Yami's desk going through a stack of paperwork. He had arrived there. He had found a note that said, gone to visit my little kitsune, be back in a few days. On the bottom was a chibi drawing of Yami blowing him kisses. Why didn't I become a doctor like my mother told me to? He complained and continued his work. Back at Mahora, Naruto and Yami were heading out of the nurse's office and was stopped by Evangeline and Chachimaru. Naruto stopped and looked at the small blonde with contempt. What do you want, chibi? Naruto stated, not in the mood for her attacks. Why you? Evangeline started, only to have Chachimaru put a hand on her shoulder, calming her down. She looked at Naruto and sighed, letting go of her anger. I am here to give you your new room key. Okay, Naruto said and looked at Chachimaru. Do you have it? He hoped. Chachimaru shook her head no and pointed at the vampire. Evangeline smiled and opened her hand. You want to come get it, she said. Well, that's too bad. I just picked the lock, he said and turned to leave when Yami stopped him. Just take the key, she said to him. But Mom, he started, but Yami stopped him. No buts, get the key, Yami ordered, and Naruto nodded in defeat. Naruto turned to face Evangeline and walked over to her slowly. He reached for the key as quickly as possible, only to have Eva close her hand. You're going to have to get closer, she said with a wicked smile. Naruto came closer and reached for the key. As he was about to take it, Evangeline grabbed his arm and bit him. Damn vampire, Naruto said and tried to pry her off. While this was going on, Yami was on the floor laughing her butt off. She knew of Naruto's fear of vampires and could never pass up a chance to watch him get mad. Chachimaru was the only one to notice the laughing woman and walked over. Hello, my name is Chachimaru, and you are? She asked Yami. Oh, Yami said and tried to stop laughing. I am Naruto, Mother Yami. It's a pleasure to meet you. It is a pleasure to meet you as well. Chachimaru said as she watched Naruto swing Evangeline into a wall, hoping she would let go. So how long have you known my son? Yami said Chachimaru. All the while Naruto was straddling the little blonde girl, trying to pry her off his hand. Since he came to the school, Chachimaru answered and blushed at the compromising position Naruto and her masters were in. She took a few pictures to use to make fun of her master later. Yami nodded and smiled. So how has he been treating you and the others? She asked. He treats us quite well, she said with a blush, remembering the kiss they shared. Yami noticed this and smiled. Well, someone is in love, she thought to herself with glee. I'm going to get grand babies. She looked at Chachimaru and said, so what do you think of my son? Chachimaru was thrown by the question. What did she think of Naruto? She thought he was a good person who took care of others, someone who never backed down from anyone. He was handsome and kind. He a good person, she said with a small blush. Yami watched this and smiled. Yeah, he is, Yami said with a smile and looked to see Naruto being straddled by Evangeline. They had been fighting for a while and Eva was almost full. Naruto on the other hand was pissed that a vampire once again bit him. Evangeline let go of him and let out a small moan of pleasure for her feeding. Thanks for the meal, she said to him with a very lustful smile. Damn vampire. He shouted and quickly got up, grabbed Evangeline by the collar of her shirt and proceeds to throw her out the window. Evangeline screamed as she flew through the air, but she had enough power, thanks to Naruto's blood, to make a decent landing. As she was about to pick her landing spot, a bird hit her, causing her to lose concentration and plummet to the earth. She landed in the lake once again. Back at the main school building, Chachimaru and Yami watched the scene unfold and Yami couldn't contain her laughter. She fell to the floor laughing and Naruto turned and gave her a dirty look. It's not funny. Yes, it is, Yami said as she continued laughing. Chachimaru watched the mother and son duo and couldn't help but smile. She turned to them and said, I be taking my leave. As she headed towards the exit, Yami stopped her. If you want a chance at my son, you better get going, Yami said, making Chachimaru blush. What are you talking about? Chachimaru replied, trying to hide her blush. Yami saw Naruto walking towards them and smiled. You know what I am talking about. She smiled at the blushing girl and head on her way. Naruto and Yami were relaxing in his new room. Naruto was glad to see his mom having a good time but was wondering what kind of trouble she was going to cause him. Yami looked at her son and smiled. So tell me, have you gotten with any of the girls? She asked him. Naruto looked at her and said, Mom. She gave him an exasperated look and said, you didn't answer my question. There is nothing to answer, he stated, hoping she would drop it. Yami looked at her son and frowned. So you're telling me that you haven't gotten close to any girl at all, even though you were at an all-girls school, she said. No, he stated. Oh no, Yami said with a sad look on her face. My son bats for the other team. She started to cry and pulls out a picture of Minato, putting to her face. Where did I go wrong? I am not gay. Naruto shouted. Yami burst out laughing and smiled at her son. I know, just playing with you. Naruto sighed and shook his head. You and your jokes. You're just an easy target, Yami replied and got up. I going to take a shower. Naruto sighed. Fine, I start on lunch. Nodoka was packing her things when Yu and Haruna entered the room. They looked at their friend and wondered what was going on. Ever since she had went to the headmaster's office, they were worried about what had happened. Yu walked up to her and said, what's going on? I'm moving in with Naruto, she said as she continued to pack her things. Haruna looked at her confused. What do you mean moving in with Naruto? Doesn't her already stay here? Nodoka looked at them and said, he was moving out and was going to move in with Zazie, but since we got in a fight over it, headmaster made use all room together. Yu looked at Nodoka and nodded. She was sad that she was leaving but glad that she was taking charge of getting Naruto. I am happy for you, she said with a smile and gave her friend a hug. Nodoka hugged her back and Haruna joined in too. I going to miss rooming with you, Nodoka said sadly. Yu and Haruna stared at their friend and smiled. We'll be fine, Yu stated and Haruna nodded. All you need to do is focus on getting Naruto. I will, Nodoka said with conviction, making her friend proud. Now let's get you over there and with Naruto, Yu said and started to help Nodoka pack. Ayaka, Zazie, and Nodoka showed up at their room all at the exact same time. Ayaka looked over her competition and smiled. I can easily beat these girls, she thought as she makes her plans to make Naruto hers. The three girls glared at each other, not moving an inch. Ayaka, finally getting tired of the stare down, said, he mind, so back off. Zazie looked at Ayaka and Nodoka with a smile on her face. She was the one who was going to win Naruto. He had made a pact with her that joined their souls for life. Nodoka and Ayaka stood there and tried to decipher what had just been said when they heard a crash and the sound of a woman scream. They forgot their fight and rushed in the room to see what was going on when they saw Naruto laying on top of the woman claimed to be his mother, who was clad in a bath towel. "What the hell is going on here?" Ayaka shouted at the top of her lungs. Flashback to inside of the room during the fight. Naruto stood by the table setting up the plates for lunch. He had made rice with thin-cut steak seasoned with a blend of Spanish spices. As he looked at his handwork, he heard the door from the bathroom open. He headed into the living room to see his mom come out only in a towel. He quickly turned around, not wanting to see her half naked, and said, "Where are your clothes?" Yami looked at her son and smiled. "They're in my bag." "Which is where?" he asked. Yami thought for a moment before saying, "I forgot." "What did you mean you forgot?" he shouted, turning around to face her. He once again noticed that she is only in a towel and quickly turns around again. Yami smiled and walked towards his dresser and opened it up, pulling out one of his shirts. "I'll wear this," she said. Naruto saw his shirt out of the corner of his eye and walked over, taking it out of her hands. "That's mine, why don't you summon your bag like always?" he said. "I don't want to." Yami whined and pulled the shirt away from Naruto. "I rather wear this." Naruto looked at her and sighed. "You're just doing this to get on my nerves," he said, and pulled the shirt pack towards him with a little too much force. Yami was pulled towards him and they fell to the floor. Yami screamed as they fell. Yami twisted and landed on the ground with Naruto on top of her. As they lay there for a moment, someone shouted, "What the hell is going on here?" End of flashback. Naruto looked at the three girls and quickly got off of Yami. "It was an accident," he said, and was about to explain the situation to them when Yami stopped him. She stood up and pulled him close. "It's okay, we don't have to hide it now," she said with a smirk. "Hide what?" Ayaka asked, with Nodoka and Zazie nodding in agreement. "That our relationship goes beyond simple mother-son," Yami said. "We are lovers." "What?" the three girls shouted at the same time. All the while Naruto had escaped his mother grasp and heard what she said. Naruto, how could you?" Nodoka said as she started to cry. "She is your mother." "It's not like that," Naruto shouted, but Yami once again stepped in to make it worse. "There is no need to lie," she said, and started to pull her towel. Naruto saw this and threw her the shirt he was holding. "Mom." Yami sat down on the couch with the girls. Naruto had stormed out of the room in rage. Yami sighed, knowing she took her joke a little too far. She looked at the three dejected girls and sighed. "I sorry for cause a fuss," she finally said, catching the other three girls' attention. "It's okay," Nodoka said quietly, not looking at her. Zazie remained silent and looked at the wall. Ayaka, on the other hand, was fuming. "It's not okay," she said with anger. "That was cruel." Yami looked at Ayaka and kept her anger in check. She was the goddess of death after all. She could whip these girls from existence with a wave. But she knew these girls cared for her son deeply. She looked at the wall and smiled. "It's been such a long time since I spent any time with Naruto," she said as she thought about when Naruto was younger. "Back then I didn't have to worry about much except taking care of my little boy." Flashback. Yami led a 5-year-old Naruto to the park to play. He held her hand tightly as they walked. It was his first time out of the palace and he was a little scared. "Are we the way yet?" he asked his mother as they walked. Yami looked at the small boy and smiled. She bent down and said, "Almost." She tickled him a little. Naruto laughed aloud for a few minutes as she tickled him. She soon stopped and they were on their way. End of flashback. "Now he all grown up and works a lot," she said. The three girls looked at Yami and sighed. They knew they could not stay mad at her. She just wanted to spend time with her son, even if she joked around. "I sorry for snapping at you," Ayaka said with her head down in shame. "It's okay," Yami said, and looked at the three girls. "So how well do you three know my son?" The girls blushed and didn't answer for a moment. Zazie said and put her hand to her neck. Yami noticed this but decided to look into it later. "He saved me," Ayaka said with a smile. Nodoka blushed and said, "He a great guy." "Well, if he has three beautiful girls after him, he must have done something right," Yami said with a smile. All three blushed. "So tell me about yourselves," Yami asked. Soon they were all talking like they had been friends for years. Naruto walked towards his dorm room after letting off some steam. He had calmed down enough and knew his mom was just joking, but it hurt seeing the look on Ayaka, Nodoka, and Zazie's faces. He was going to apologize to his mother and try to find a way to make it up to the girls. As he entered the room, he heard the sound of laughter come from the living room. Curiosity got the better of him and he went to investigate, only to find Yami surrounded by the girls looking at a picture of him when he was younger. Was the time I took him trick-or-treating and he dressed up as Batman, Yami said with a smile. Isn't her cute? Oh, he is so precious, Nodoka said with a smile. He is so adorable, Ayaka said, making a mental note to try and get a set of pictures for her so she can start her collection. Zazie nodded in agreement. Naruto smiled at this and watched as they fawned over his baby pictures. Naruto smiled sudden turn to a frown when he heard Yami said she was pulling out his bathing pictures. Naruto knew it was a good time to make himself known. Hey, he said as he pretended to just had gotten back. Naruto, the three girls said and tackled him to the ground. Naruto smiled and hugged them back. So it seems you four have been having fun, he said as he looked at them. Soon everyone was laughing as embarrassing stories were told about little Naruto. As the day came to an end, Yami had turned in for the night saying she was going to spend her entire day with Naruto and the girls. Naruto smiled at this but was a little worried and hoped nothing insane would happen. Please let tomorrow turn out okay, he said to himself and headed toward his bed. Nodoka watched and waited for everyone to go to bed. She wanted to sleep with Naruto again, and was going to make sure she was the only one to do it. As she waited for the other to fall asleep, she smiled as she remembered all the stories Yami told about Naruto when he was younger. I hope one day I can hear her tell my kids about those times, she said to herself and smiled. She saw that the coast was clear and headed towards Naruto's bed. As she was about to open the door, someone said, "What are you doing?" Nodoka turned around to see Ayaka and Zazie standing behind her. Nodoka turned beet red and looked like a deer caught in the headlights. She quickly stood up and said, "Nothing." You were going to sneak into Naruto's room, Ayaka said. No, Nodoka stammered and tried to hide her blush but she failed. Oh no, Ayaka said and looked at her, you're not going in there without me. Wait, what? Nodoka said. Ayaka, not wanting to wait any longer, pulled Nodoka along and entered his room only to find Zazie already snuggled up next to a sleeping Naruto. They looked at the other girl with anger but it soon passed as they entered the bed and soon joined them in dreamland. As this was going on, Yami watched from a corner with a smile. I going to get grand babies, she whispered to herself and danced around. End of chapter 11. Omake. Naruto, Fear of Vampire. Age 6. Naruto and Yami were visiting a friend from one of the other worlds. Naruto sat outside bored and wanted to do something when he noticed a girl about his age with silver hair playing with a ball not too far away. He headed over to her wondering if she would like to play. Hi, he said, getting the girl's attention. She looked at him with caution and said, hi. Naruto smiled at the girl, making her blush a bit. I Naruto. Yami, what's your name? The girl looked at him for a moment before answering, Mocha Blood Driver. Nice to meet you, Mocha, he said. Do you want to play? I don't play with humans, she said. I'm not human, he replied with a hump. I am a Shinigami in training. Sure you are, Mocha said sarcastically. Too, Naruto replied back. Am not, Mocha teased. Or two, am not. Or two, am not. Naruto looked at her and said, or two, I prove it to you. Naruto looked at a tree and pointed to fingers at it. Bakudo number 4 Bakuri. And a small bolt of lightning left his fingers. See, he said with a smile. Okay then, Mocha said with an evil smile, let's play. She threw the ball as hard as she could at him. Naruto wasn't prepared for this and was hit in the face with the ball. He fell backwards as a little blood came out of his nose. That hurt, he said on the verge of tears, but Mocha was not paying attention. The smell of his blood was driving her wild. She walked towards him and knelt down next to him. She sniffed the air before pulling him into a hug and biting his neck. Naruto sat there frozen as Mocha sucked his blood. She finished a few minutes later, leaving a very stunned Naruto. If your blood tastes that good, I'm going to have to play with you more often, Mocha said, looking at Naruto like he was a buffet. Naruto got up as he put a hand over his neck. He looked at the girl for a second before running at full speed shouting, Mommy, why, L. Age 12. Naruto was once again on a trip with his mother to visit a place called Cross Academy. As they walked towards the school, he noticed that a few people wore different uniforms than the others. As Yami met with the headmaster, Naruto waited outside. He was practicing fighting with his kunai when he noticed a girl about his age with blonde hair, wearing a white uniform, coming towards him. He watched her for a moment only to go back to practicing. He didn't notice the girl stop to look at him. Who is he? She thought and walked towards him. Hi, she said, startling Naruto, nearly making him cut himself. Hi Naruto. Yami, and you are? Naruto asked the girl. I am Rima Toya, she said. Naruto nodded and started to practice again only to cut himself. Ow, Naruto muttered and put some pressure on the cut. The girl looked at him with smile. She had gotten a whiff of his blood and she was having a hard time restraining herself. She took out a handkerchief and walked over to him. "Here, let me help." Naruto removed his hand from the cut, allowing the girl to put her handkerchief on it. As this was going on, she got another whiff of his blood. She couldn't help herself, it was intoxicating. She had never smelled such a heavenly and powerful blood before. As she applied pressure, she moved closer to Naruto. He noticed this and asked, "Are you okay?" The girl smiled at him and said, "Just fine." She was very close to him. Naruto was getting uncomfortable and was about to pull away when she pulled him into a hug. He froze. He had never been hugged by a cute girl before, except the one time, but he shuddered, wanting to forget that time. The girl pulled him close and smiled, revealing her fangs. "Just a taste," she whispers to him, causing Naruto to wonder what she meant, but he soon found out when she bit him. Once again he was being sucked dry by another vampire. She finished and cleaned her mouth of excess blood. "Thanks for the meal," she said with a smile. "I love to get to know you more." Naruto looked at her and shouted, "Damn vampires," catching the attention of the other children in white uniforms. Soon you could see him running for his life from a horde of them. The blonde girl just smiled and went to class. Age 15. Naruto was walking towards Yokai Academy on an assignment from Kami. It was his job to make sure the monster in the school were behaving. As he walked towards the main building, he looked around for any signs of a silver-haired girl. He was told that Mocha was attending this school and he was scared he was going to run into her. "Damn vampires," he muttered as he walked around campus, not noticing a pink-haired girl walking towards him. Soon they ran into each other and they fell to the ground. "Ow," the girl said, rubbing her backside. Naruto stood up and offered his hand. "Sorry about that," he said. "It's okay," she replied before looking at him. "Do I know you?" she asked. Naruto looked at her for a moment and thought. "I don't think so," he said. She nodded and continued on her way. Naruto just shrugged and went to the headmaster off. A while later he was heading to the bus stop when he noticed something fly by. He looked to see what it was, saw it was the girl from before. She was hurt a bit and he knelt down to help her, only to have a large tree be thrown at him. He picked the girl up and dodged. As he landed he accidentally pulled of her Rosario. Mocha power came forth and she turned back into her true form. Naruto watched this in fear. Mocha looked down at Naruto and smiled. Well, isn't it my friend Naruto?" she said with a smile. She pushed him down and straddled him. She leaned in and began to drink her fill. Naruto just laid there frozen. "Why me?" he thought as he felt his blood be drank away. She stopped and cleaned her mouth. "Thanks for the meal," she said, and got up, taking the Rosario from him. Naruto laid there as she walked away. "Damn vampires," he shouted. Mocha had put on the Rosario and smiled. Pink-haired Mocha was worried. She felt that she betrayed Sukune. The real Mocha just told her this. "It's our little secret." Naruto woke with a yawn and tried to sit up, only to feel a few people resting against him, 3 to be in fact. He lifted his head and saw Nodoka, Zazie, and Ayaka lying next to him asleep. He looked at the 3 girls and sighed. "Might as well go back to sleep," he said to himself, and laid back down and got comfortable. Yami had woken up and was starting her morning routine when she noticed that Naruto wasn't up. She went to his room and watched as the 4 teenagers slept soundly on the bed. Yami felt a little mischievous and summoned her camera. "Say grand babies," she whispered to herself and took a picture. Nodoka woke up as snuggled close to Naruto, not wanting to get up. "This is heaven," she whispered, only to hear a voice agree with her. She turned and saw Ayaka on his other side with a smile, but they soon noticed that Zazie was lying nearly on top of him. Both girls were fuming over where the acrobat was but didn't want to wake Naruto. Nodoka was about to get up when she noticed Zazie stirring. Zazie opened her eyes and looked at Naruto's sleeping face. She smiled and laid her head on his chest and proceeded to fall back asleep. "Lucky," both Nodoka and Ayaka muttered. Since neither girl could go back to sleep, they decided to plan for the day's upcoming events. Last night Yami had called and told Kano and Negi that they were not going to be in class today. They tried to fight it, but all Yami had to do was whisper something that made them agree. Nodoka looked at the other blonde and said, "WH, what should we do?" "Well, I have my game plan," Ayaka replied as she reluctantly got out of bed. "You're on your own." "Fine," Nodoka said with conviction, but a little loud, causing Naruto to wake up. "Mom, I don't want to go to school today," he mumbled as he tried to sit up. This motion woke Zazie, who started to do the rub the sleep for her eyes. He saw the 3 girls in his room and smiled. "Good morning." "Morning," everyone said, and got up to start the day. As he was about to get out of the bed, Zazie stopped him and said, "Not now," Naruto said, turning red. Nodoka and Ayaka watched this and wondered what the silent girl had asked. Zazie gave Naruto a pouty face, causing him to try and resist her cuteness. Must resist, he said to himself, but Zazie pressed her attack. She leaned in close so he could feel her against his skin. She said to him as she pulled him close. Naruto couldn't resist her. Fine, he said with a sigh. Zazie smiled and leaned in close, capturing his lips with hers. Nodoka and Ayaka watched in horror as Zazie kissed Naruto passionately. Zazie broke the kiss and smiled. She looked at the other girls, giving them a beat that look. She looked at Naruto and kissed him once more before heading towards the bathroom. Ayaka stood there frozen. Zazie had just kissed Naruto in front of them. She wasn't going to have it. She wasn't going to let that flexible floozy take her man. She walked up to Naruto and looked him dead in the eye. "Kiss me," she said, causing Naruto to look like a deer caught in the headlights. "Come again," he said, acting confused. "Kiss me," she said with conviction. Naruto looked at her and leaned in, capturing her lips with his. They shared this moment for a few more seconds before breaking apart. "Happy?" Naruto asked as he blushed. He had just kissed two very beautiful girls in one morning. Ayaka smiled and touched her lips. "Very," she replied and headed out the door. Naruto turned and faced a blushing Nodoka and smiled. "You want one too?" he asked, and she gave a quick nod in agreement. He walked over to her and kissed her. Nodoka kissed back and pulled him close. Soon they were wrapped in each other's arm, making out. They stayed that way for a few more minutes before breaking apart. "Wow," Nodoka said with a smile. Naruto stood there with a huge smile on his face. "It's always the quiet ones," he mumbled and headed out of his room. As everyone was sat down to breakfast, Yami noticed a big smile on all of their face, especially Naruto's. She knew her son well enough to know he was feeling pretty lucky for having 3 girls after him. She smiled to herself and made plans to bring them closer together. She looked at everyone and smiled. Naruto noticed this smile and shivered. She was up to no good. Smile. "This is going to be a long day," he thought to himself as he ate. Yami looked at Ayaka and said, "So ladies, do you know any good places for shopping?" "Of course," Ayaka replied with a smile. "I know all the best shopping around here." "Good," Yami said with a smile, "because we're having a shopping day." "Yeah." The 3 girls cheered, much to the dismay of their male companion. "Well, since you girls are going shopping, Naruto started to say, but was cut off by Yami. "You're coming with," she said to him, giving him a stern glare. "Yes ma'am," he said quickly, making his crushes giggle. Ayaka led the group down the boardwalk, showing them all the different stores. The girls and Yami all talked excitedly while Naruto trailed behind slowly. "Why me?" he thought as he remembered his mother's last shopping trip. It had ended with him carrying home at least 300 pounds worth of sealing scrolls. He had a feeling this was going to be twice as bad. They soon stopped in front of a dress store and quickly entered. Naruto hung back, hoping they wouldn't notice him trying to slip away, but Yami grabbed his collar and pulled him inside. "You're not going anywhere," she said to him. "Who promised to spend the entire day with me and the girls?" "I did," he said as he cried anime tears. "Now that's right, so take it like a man," she said and dragged him inside. Naruto looked around and saw all the kinds of dress hanging on the racks. He watched as the other went through racks, picking out ones they liked. He stood by a wall and sighed. A shopping clerk noticed him standing there and walked over. "How are you today?" she asked with a smile. "Just fine," he replied with a sigh. "That's nice," she said as she watched Yami and the girls shop. "You are such a nice guy to come and help with their shopping." "Yeah," Naruto said. "I didn't have a choice," he thought to himself. "So you single?" she asked, taking him by surprise. Naruto looked at the clerk and smiled. "Sorry, I taken." "Really, that too bad," she said and looked at the girls. "So which one is your girlfriend?" Naruto looked at the clerk and smiled. "That's for me to know." She sighed, knowing she wouldn't get anything out of him, and headed over to help the girls. Naruto sighed. It was going to be a very long day. Nodoka stood next to a clothes rack and couldn't decide what to get. Yami noticed this and a devious plan formed in her mind. She looked at her son, then back at the 3 girls and smiled evilly. She waved over to Naruto. He noticed this and headed toward her with a sigh. She smiled and waited for him to stop in front of her. "Yes?" he asked, wondering what she wanted. Yami looked at him with a grin and said, "Well, we need your opinion?" Naruto gave her a confused look and replied, "Why do you need my opinion?" "I don't need your opinion," she said, shaking her head. She pointed at the girls and said, "They need your opinion." "On what?" Naruto said, confused. Yami sighed and pulled him towards the dressing room and sat him down at one of the couches. "Just sit here and wait." Naruto nodded and watched as his mom went to talk to the girls. He wondered what they were talking about. What he could tell from the facial expression that they were nervous about something. He watched as they walked over and Yami pushed them each into a different dressing room. She turned to her son and said, "You're going to enjoy this." Yami smiled and went to a different part of the store, leaving Naruto to stare at three closed doors. As Naruto waited, Nodoka was freaking out in her dressing room. When Yami had walked over and told them what she planned, she blushed. "I can't do this," she thought to herself, but heard the sound of the door next to her opening. She watched as Ayaka stepped out of the dressing room wearing a very sexy ruffled black dress. The front cut off at the knee and there was a train in the back. Nodoka watched as it showed of her body well. Ayaka walked towards Naruto and twirled around. "What do you think?" she asked him with a sultry smile. Naruto couldn't help but stare at her. She was beautiful. The dress showed her beauty off perfectly. "You look great," he said, finally getting out of his stupor. "Thank you," Ayaka replied happily. "I'll think I get this one." Naruto just nodded and watched as she went back into the dressing room. Nodoka was fuming that Ayaka was the first to get his opinion and he liked what she was wearing. She looked at the dresses she had chosen and found one that caught her eye. It was a light blue sundress that tied around her neck. She chose it and started to change. Zazie sat in the dressing room wondering which dress she should try. There were so many different ones that she had taken in with her but couldn't choose one to show to Naruto. As she was choosing, Nodoka had finished changing. She looked at herself in the mirror and was happy with her appearance. She slowly opened the door and walked out. Naruto watched as she walked out and towards him. He was enamored with her beauty. The dress hung over her frame, lightly hugging her curves. She modeled the dress for him a bit. She was blushing so hard but she didn't care. She loved the way Naruto was looking at her. She could see the love in his eyes for her and she was ecstatic. She leaned down, letting him get a decent look at her cleavage. "What do you think of this one?" she asked quietly. "You look great," he said as he blushed. Nodoka blushed and twirled around. "I'm glad you like it," she said with a loving voice. "I have a few more to try on, so wait here." Naruto nodded dumbly and watched her go back into her dressing room. Finally the final door opened, revealing Zazie in a very sexy red dress. It hugged her body tightly, showing off her impressive figure. It was very low cut so he could see a lot of skin. Naruto couldn't help but get a little turned on by seeing her in that dress. He quickly covered his lap with his jacket to hide his growing tent. Zazie walked over to him with a slight sway to her hips. Naruto tried to calm down, but she was turning him on so much as she walked. She showed off for him a bit, then sat down in his lap, putting her arms around his neck. She said with a sultry smile. Naruto stayed silent for a moment before saying one word, "Wow." Zazie smiled at this and kissed him. Soon they were lost in each other for a few moments before Zazie broke away. She stood back up and went towards her dressing room. Before she entered, she turned and said, Naruto blushed heavily and tried to get the idea of taking Zazie in the dressing room right now out of his head. Zazie smiled and blew him a kiss before entering her dressing room. Naruto just sat there trying to stay calm. While Naruto was with the girls, Sasuke had come to Mahora looking for Naruto. As he walked around, he felt the strong magic coming off Negi and a plan started to form in his mind. He followed the little boy silently and waited till he was alone. Negi walked back towards the dorms after a long day of practice. He was by himself while Asuna trained with Setsuna to get better with her sword. As he walked, he felt an evil presence around him. He quickly picked up the pace, but the feeling persisted. He suddenly felt a presence behind him and turned around quickly, finding nothing there. As he sighed and turned around, he screamed. He soon fell unconscious. The last thing he saw was red and black eyes staring into his soul. Naruto and the girls soon returned to the room. He was carrying a lot of storage scrolls. Most were filled with his mother purchases. Nodoka was quite happy with how the day had gone and couldn't wait for more. Ayaka was glad she had gotten Naruto attention and was planning ways to get him to look at her alone. Finally, Zazie was trying not to have perverted thoughts about Naruto ripping a certain red dress off her body. As he set everything down, he failed to notice the three girls come towards him. Zazie was the first to him and pulled him into a passionate kiss. Naruto was soon kissing her back and she melted into his arms. As Zazie broke away, Ayaka took her place, giving him yet another passion-filled kiss. Finally, Nodoka came up and kissed him, her lips dancing across his. After they had finished, Naruto stood there for a moment before falling to the ground with a large grin on his face. Sasuke stood next to a now hypnotized Negi and his Pactio partners. Soon he would have his revenge on Naruto, very soon. Naruto stood next to a fountain in the quad waiting on his date. He received a letter from someone requesting a meeting. He made sure it wasn't Evangeline and decided to meet the person. He knew it was a female from the handwriting and the way the latter was delivered. Nodoka and the other were weary of this and tried to talk him out of it. He just simply smiled and reassured them he wouldn't do anything to hurt them. So now he stood and waited for the mystery person to appear. I am glad you could make it, said a voice from behind Naruto, causing him to turn and see Chachimaru standing there. She was wearing a light blue top with a skirt that showed off her legs. So you sent me the letter? Naruto asked, and she just nodded. Well then, shall we be off? He held his arm out and she put her through. All the while 3 pairs of eyes glared at Chachimaru with jealousy. They soon followed the pair as they headed out. Naruto felt Chachimaru lean into him and he let her. They walked down the road and turned into the park. As they walked silently down the lane, the 3 tailing them were fuming. A date in the park, Nodoka said with sadness. That the date I wanted. Will you stop it and help us follow them so we can make sure she doesn't do anything? Ayaka said and pulled Nodoka along. Zazie walked ahead of them and turned around. I know that. Ayaka said with anger. Zazie replied with a sigh and pointed down the road. Naruto and Chachimaru were nowhere to be seen. No, we lost them. Ayaka cried with anime tears. Maybe it was for the best. Nodoka said and Zazie nodded in agreement. Traitors, Ayaka called at them as they walked away. Zazie said as they walked back to the dorms. Naruto and Chachimaru had settled in a small cafe near the edge of campus. They sat in silence and waited for their food to arrive. So Chachimaru, how have you been? Naruto asked, trying to break the silence. I have been doing well, she answered. That's great, he replied, and they settled back into silence. Chachimaru looked at the blonde and couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking for asking him out like this. She knew he made her feel something that she had never felt before, and when they kissed she felt as if she was on fire. She wanted to feel that again, she wanted to be close to him. So how the little bloodsucker, Naruto said with contempt. She is doing well, she still craves your blood though, she replied as she remembered her master's rants about how good his blood was. Oh joy. Naruto said as he shuddered. Why do not like vampires? Chachimaru asked him. Naruto was caught off guard by this but answered. Let's say over the years I have had a couple of run-in with them that I rather forget. Let me guess, they all loved your blood, Chachimaru said with a giggle. Pretty much, he replied. Well, hopefully you will find one who hates your blood, Chachimaru said. That'll be the day, he said with a sigh. Yes it will, Chachimaru replied. Soon they settled into a very light conversation and soon they were talking and laugh. Soon there came and gone, but they kept talking. Then he said, that was the power of youth, Naruto said as he and Chachimaru burst out laughing. Naruto noticed that this was the first time he had heard Chachimaru really laugh. He slowly stopped laughing and looked at Chachimaru with interest. Chachimaru noticed that he was staring at her and blushed a bit. Is there something on my face? She asked, wondering if he was judging her. You have a beautiful laugh, you know that? He said with a smile. It sounds heavenly. Chachimaru blushed and smoke started to come out of her head. Thank you, she said with a smile. You're every welcome, he said and stood up and held out his hand. Shall we be off then? She smiled and took his hand. The pair ended up in front of a tall building with a sign that stated, Ace's Ballroom. Why are we here? Chachimaru asked. Naruto smiled and opened the door. It's a secret. I don't like secrets, Chachimaru said. This is a good secret, Naruto said in a reassuring voice. Chachimaru just nodded and stepped inside with Naruto right behind. As they headed down the hallway, she could hear music coming from the room at the end. They reached it and she saw people dancing. They were all in sync with the music and flying across the dance floor. Welcome, a voice said from across the room, and a woman with short green hair and a large smile walked over. She had a very nice figure and such grace about her. I'm Asa, are you here for some lessons? Naruto smiled. Yes we are, he said. Wonderful, which style, Latin, or ballroom? Asa asked with a smile. I say a mixture of both, he replied. How that sounds, Chachimaru? It's fine with me, Chachimaru said with a blush. Excellent, but first we need to get your partner ready, Asa said and pulled Chachimaru away from Naruto. Chachimaru was going to pull away when she felt the warmth come of Asa and let her lead her away from the blonde. What are you going to do? Chachimaru asked Asa. Just something that will make that young man you came with drool, Asa said, and they entered a side room. Naruto stood against the wall and waited for the pair to return. His mind began to wander and it settled on Chachimaru. They had been friendly to each other since they met, even when hurt her during Evangeline attack on him. She didn't hold a grudge about it at all. He smiled as he remembered his meetings with her. He also remembered back at the tree when he dreamed that they kissed. It felt so real to him and he wished to kiss her again. No bad Naruto. He chided himself. She just a friend, but a very attractive friend. As he had his internal debate, he failed to notice Asa and Chachimaru walking towards him. Excuse me, Asa said, making Naruto turn his head. He blushed when he saw Chachimaru. She was wearing a strapless red dress and heels. He couldn't stop staring at her. "How'd I look?" she asked him, and all Naruto could do was nod his head. Asa smiled at this. "See, I told you he would be speechless," she said to Chachimaru. "No, can you get him moving? Our lesson will be starting soon." "Naruto, come on, the class is starting," she said, shaking him. Naruto snapped back into reality. "Oh right, sorry," he said as he blushed. "It's fine," Chachimaru said, and they walked out onto the dance floor. They looked around and noticed they were the only ones there. "Where is everyone?" Naruto asked. Asa smiled. "Oh, them, their lesson ended when I was with Chachimaru," she said, "so I had a private lesson for you too." "Oh, well, that's nice," Naruto said and blushed. Chachimaru saw this and blushed as well. "Just us?" she thought with a smile. "Now let's begin," Asa said and turned towards the pair. "We will be learning the waltz first. Now I want you to follow my steps." Naruto and Chachimaru nodded and Asa smiled. "First is the box step," she proceeded to explain the steps. Naruto and Chachimaru practiced the steps separately. For Naruto it was very easy to get it down, but Chachimaru couldn't seem to get it right. Her mind couldn't comprehend the steps that well, so she would stumble a little every so often. Asa noticed this and decided what was the best way to fix it. "Both of you come here," she said, and they walked over. Asa smiled and pulled out a blindfold and put it over Chachimaru's eyes. "What are you doing?" Chachimaru said. "Just trust me," Asa said, and pushed her towards Naruto. She helped them get into the proper hold and smile. "Now Naruto, I want you to lead Chachimaru around her dance floor, and Chachimaru, trust Naruto that you have to do." Chachimaru was a little nervous but nodded. Naruto noticed this. "Trust me," he said. Chachimaru nodded and he smiled. Asa started the music and the pair began to dance. Naruto stepped forward, causing Chachimaru to step back. She was a little scared to let him lead her, but then she remembered his words. "Trust me." Those two words made her calm down and allow him to guide her across the floor. Soon they were gliding across the dance floor. They flowed with the music. As they danced, Chachimaru couldn't help but feel happy as she allowed Naruto guide her. The music soon ended and the pair broke away from one another. Chachimaru took off the blindfold and looked at Naruto, who was smiling. "Excellent," Asa said to them. "That was simply wonderful." "Thank you," they said in unison. "Now let's move on to the next dance," Asa said, and the pair nodded. Naruto and Chachimaru finished learning the basic of the jive and looked at their dance teacher with interest. "You both have done so well today," Asa said. "I just have one more dance to teach you, the Viennese waltz." Now the Viennese waltz is a very intimate dance, so prepare to be very close. The pair nodded and they followed Asa as she taught them the steps, but she also taught turns and other moves. Once again she finished her instruction and Asa started the music. "Let the music flow through you," she said as she watched the pair get into hold. They started off slow but soon were all over the floor. Chachimaru could feel her emotions grow as they danced. She could feel her feeling for him come to the surface, and Naruto was the same. They danced all over the dance floor, and even when the music stopped, Naruto dipped Chachimaru and looked directly into her eyes. He could see her soul and couldn't help but want to get closer. He leaned in and captured her lips. Chachimaru kissed him back and they stayed that way for a few moments before breaking apart. He slowly let her up and couldn't help but smile. She was the last one who could steal his heart. Chachimaru knew that he was the one. He was the one who could make her feel love. "That was beautiful," Asa said as tears streamed down her face. "You two were just wonderful." "Thank you," they said in unison, causing them to blush. "Come back anytime," Asa said, and then she turned to Chachimaru. "Also, you can keep the dress." "Thank you," she said, and they left the dance studio hand in hand. They walked down the street in happy silence, only to end up under the world tree. "Seem we will always end up here," Naruto said with a smile. "So it seems," Chachimaru answered. "Well, I glad," he said, and pulled her into another kiss. "Well, isn't that just wonderful?" a voice from behind them said, causing the pair to turn. Standing there was Sasuke and Mana. Mana seemed to be in some form of daze, and Sasuke just looked at the pair in disgust. Well, it seemed the Dobi finally found a girl. "What do you want, Teme?" Naruto said, stepping in front of Chachimaru. "Simple, your death," Sasuke said, and charged him. Naruto blocked his first attack and threw a left hook at his face. Sasuke dodged the punch and tried to knee Naruto in the stomach. Naruto blocked and uses the momentum to make some space. "You never know when to quit, do you?" Naruto said, and he got into his stance. "I am a Uchiha, I always win in the end," Sasuke said and charged. While that fight was going on, Chachimaru had her hand full fighting Mana. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Mana. She dodged a barrage of bullets. "Master orders," Mana said and kept firing. Chachimaru kept dodging her attacks and activated her rockets. She rushed Mana and grabbed her gun, snapping it in half. She then proceeded to knock her out. She turned to watch the battle between Naruto and Sasuke. As she turned, she was caught in a large explosion shaking the entire school. Naruto stood at on one side, blood going down his arm, while Sasuke stood on the other, cuts all over his body. "Getting sluggish, Teme," Naruto said with a laugh. "Shut up, Dobi." Sasuke shouted back and took a step forward only to stumble. "Damn, you got me good." "Seems that way," Naruto said and smiled. "Now to finish it." Naruto charged forward, his fist cocked, covered in shadows. "Death punch," he said and threw the punch at Sasuke. Sasuke managed to dodge to the side but was hit hard in the arm, leaving a black mark all over his arm. "Damn, missed," Naruto said as the shadows fell away from his fist. "Damn you, Teme," Sasuke said as he held his arm in pain. "I'll kill you." "You keep saying that but I still hear," Naruto said. "You must really suck at killing people." "You Dobi," Sasuke said, then saw Chachimaru. "If I can't kill you now, I just settle for her." Sasuke shot forward and charged Chachimaru. "No," Naruto said and charged after him, but he was too late. Sasuke attack blew Chachimaru into pieces. "That will teach you," Sasuke said and ran away. "Chachimaru," Naruto said as he held her head. "It seems I am dying," she said as a small tear fell down her face. "How is that?" she thought. "You're not going to die," he said, trying to reassure her. "You are lying," she said as her eyes slowly closed. "I just want to tell you. She shut down fully. "Damn it," he said, but then he felt her soul appear next to him. "Naruto," she said. He looked and saw her and couldn't help but blush. She was beautiful. She looked like a normal human in her soul form, but she had a lovely smile on her face. "Good, you haven't moved on by yourself," he said in relief. "It seems that way," she said. "So what are we going to do now?" "This," Naruto said, and his tails and ears appeared. Before he could start the ritual, Chachimaru jumped him and started to rub his ears. "Cute. Can you please do that after I finish?" he said, trying not to let her know he was enjoying it. "Oh, sorry," she said. "Thanks," he said and leaned in close to her and bit her neck. She was wrapped in his tails and soon a bright light filled the area. Sitting in front of him was Chachimaru in her new body. She was completely human, but she had armor all around her. "Warrior," he said with a smile. "You're my beautiful warrior." She smiled and kissed him. Naruto and Chachimaru walked towards Evaniline Cottage in silence. Naruto knew that since she died and made a pact with him, her pact with the little vampire was ended. He wasn't looking forward to telling her that either. Chachimaru could see that he was nervous and squeezed his hand in reassurance that everything was going to be all right. Naruto smiled, thankful for the gesture, but soon they came up to the door. "This is going to suck," he thought to himself as they walked in. As they entered, they noticed the little was watching TV and laughing. She failed to notice the pair for a few minutes only until Chachimaru touched her on the shoulder. She turned to look at them and noticed that Chachimaru was human. "What happened?" she asked, giving Naruto the evil eye. Naruto just looked back and gave her a smile. "Well," he said and explained all that had happened that day. As Eva listened, she looked over at Chachimaru and marveled at her changes. She was no longer the robotic partner she had before. She was a beautiful living and breathing girl. Naruto finished his story and looked at the small blonde, wondering what her response would be. "So you are telling me instead of an android partner, I'm going to have a living partner?" Eva said, only to see Naruto pale a bit. No," he said as he scooted closer to Chachimaru. "You went from having an android partner to have a living and breathing friend. She is no longer your partner." Evangeline was silent for a moment before exploding. "What do you mean I no longer have a partner anymore?" Naruto looked at the little vampire with surprise and awe. For someone that small, she sure packed a lot of power in her lungs. "I was going to explain that," he said, waiting for her to calm down. Evangeline looked at him and sat down, still angry. "Okay, the reason why she is no longer your partner is because to give her a new body she had to form a pact with me. As a Shinigami, my pacts would supersede yours, making it void." "So she is your partner now?" Evangeline said with an evil glint in her eyes. "Yes," he replied, not liking the look she was giving him. "Then I demand compensation," she said, making Naruto stare at her in shock. He was frozen for a few moments before saying, "You want what?" Evangeline smiled. "I want compensation," she said, as if it was the most simple thing in the world. "You took my partner from me and I am demanding something of equal value in exchange." Naruto was weary of Evangeline and gave her a confused look, like what? Evangeline smiled and pretended to think about it, but Naruto knew what she wanted. Well, I need help finding a new partner, so until then you will allow me to drink your blood. How about I help you find a new partner instead? He asked, hoping she would take the deal. No, it my offer or no deal, she replied, making Naruto deadpan. Chachimaru looked at her Naruto and gave him a reassuring smile. It will be fine, she whispered to him. She didn't say what condition the blood needs to be in. Naruto smiled and kissed her on the cheek. I love you so much right now, he said, then looked back towards Evangeline. Fine, it is a deal then. She smiled and went to drink, but he stopped her. I will send you the first few bags in a couple days, he said as he and Chachimaru got up. What do you mean send a few bags in a few days? Evangeline questioned. You said you wanted to drink my blood, but you didn't say it had to be fresh, he said with a smile. Evangeline went to argue but knew he was right. Fine, she said with a frown, but I want it as soon as possible. Naruto smiled as he opened the door, allowing Chachimaru to step out. Will do, he said with a smile. Damn loopholes, she said and went to her room, hoping that her new supply of blood would get there soon. Naruto and Chachimaru walked towards his room to explain what had happened between them that day. They reached the room and headed inside only to notice that no one was there. Naruto sighed and sat down on the couch while Chachimaru sat beside him. Soon she was resting her head on his shoulder, and soon the pair fell asleep on the couch. While this was going on, Ayaka, Zazie, and Nodoka were out shopping. They had lost Naruto on his date with Chachimaru, and after a while of waiting for him to return they decided to go out. They were currently in a dress store trying on different dresses to wear when they had a fancy date with Naruto. They were all having a good time and then noticed the time. We should head back, Nodoka said as she picked up the dress she wanted. Zazie and Ayaka nodded and they paid for their items and headed back towards home. They soon noticed that everyone was looking at them funny. What up with them? Ayaka said to her companions, and they just gave her a shrug. They sped up and soon arrived back at their room and walked inside. They set their bags down and saw Naruto sitting on the couch with a beautiful girl asleep beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. Who the hell is she? They all thought with a hint of jealousy. They wanted to wake them up and question what they were doing. Unfortunately, they didn't want to get Naruto angry, so they let the pair sleep. A little while later, Naruto began to awaken and felt weight on his shoulder. He turned and smiled, looking at the sleeping face of Chachimaru. He kissed her on the forehead and turned only to see Nodoka, Ayaka, and Zazie standing in front of him. Glad to see you're awake, Ayaka said with a smile that chilled Naruto to the bone. Hey, how are you? He asked, trying to find a way to get out of this without getting sent to the hospital. Zazie looked at him and then at Chachimaru. Naruto looked at her and was about to answer when Ayaka cut him off. Can you explain her, please? She said with a hint of anger. Well, Naruto said, but Chachimaru started to wake. She rubbed her eyes. Everyone looked at her and she looked back. Hello everyone, she said with a smile. Hello, Nodoka said, returning the smile, but it quickly went away by a glare from Ayaka. Ayaka looked at Chachimaru and gave her a stern look. And who might you be? I know you quite well, Ayaka, we are in the same class, Chachimaru said, wondering why Ayaka didn't recognize her. I have never met you before in my life, Ayaka said, and was about to continue when Naruto cut her off. You know her, he said. This is Chachimaru. The three girls looked at her closely and saw that it was Chachimaru, but without her usual ears. What? Naruto and Chachimaru covered their ears as they screamed and waited for them to calm down. All three girls looked at their boyfriend and gave him a serious look. Explain now, Ayaka said. Naruto sighed and explained all that happened while they were on the date. He left out the details on what they did until their fight with Sasuke, where he described in detail what had happened. He finally explained how Chachimaru ended up this way and the pact they had made. Everyone's reaction to this was surprising. Ayaka was made at first but knew he did it to save a life, and it was of someone who loved him just as much as she did. Nodoka was happy that she was safe but was a little jealous of her having made a pact with Naruto. Finally Zazie smiled. She was happy that another pact was formed and now she had help if something happened. Naruto watched them for a few moments before smiling. Well, it seems they're taking it well, he said to himself as the girls started to talk and laugh. It had been a few weeks since Chachimaru had joined the group and everyone was having a good time. He took a different girl out on a date every night, much to their joy. Life had settled into a very calm routine, but Naruto could not shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often he would notice that nearly everyone in the school were staring at him and his group. He knew something bad was going to happen, and it was going to be soon. He woke up with a smile looking at his girls. He couldn't help but smile at them, but soon turned and saw his mother standing there with a camera in her hands. She sees that he is awake and smiles before she disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. He growled and got up, heading towards the bathroom. He quickly got ready for the day but couldn't shake the feeling something bad was going to happen. He made breakfast and waited for everyone else to come out ready for the day. Soon everyone was up and ready for the day and they were headed out the door. As they walked towards the school they noticed that it was too quiet. There was no one besides them out on the road. They continued down the street and still not a sound was heard except the echo of their own footsteps. "I don't like this," Naruto said as he pulled a kunai from his pouch ready for an attack. Zazie was looking around ready to cast a silent Kido at a moment's notices. Chachimaru had summoned her twin short blades, not wanting to be surprised by an attack. They finally entered the main quad of the campus and stopped by the fountain. Usually there were a lot of people walking around this place at this time, but it was as dead as night there. Naruto knew that something wasn't right and summoned 2 Hashin kunai and gave them to Nodoka and Ayaka. "Hold on to these," he said as he handed them to each girl. "Just touch the handle and think of the room and it will take you there. I want you to promise me if something happens you will do that." Nodoka and Ayaka nodded, knowing he was doing this for their protection. "I promise," they said at the same time, getting a smile from him. "That is my girls," he said and stood up. He turned towards Zazie and Chachimaru and nodded. They took up a triangle formation around Ayaka and Nodoka. As they walked, Naruto's phone rang, making them all jump. He quickly picked up the phone. "Yes," he whispered. It was his mother on the other end. "You need to get back here now." "Why?" he asked, only to suddenly see some girls walk towards them. He smiled, but it soon turned to a frown when he noticed they were holding sticks and other simple weapons. The charged and Naruto dropped his phone so he could block an attack. He quickly disarmed the girl and knocked her out. Soon he, Zazie, and Chachimaru were fighting off the horde of girls and were slowly losing ground. If these were his regular enemies he would have killed them where they stood, but these were students under someone's control and he couldn't harm them. "Nodoka, Zazie, go now," he said and watched them both disappear in a flash. He sighed in relief as they headed back the room under the protection of his mother. He soon turned his attention to the attackers and stepped up his game. They soon dispatched almost all the attackers, but more seemed to keep coming. He grabbed both Zazie and Chachimaru and disappeared in a flash. They landed on the roof of one of the taller buildings of the campus and sat down. "What the hell is going on?" he said as he sat there. Zazie leaned against him and sighed. "I hear yay," he said and ran his hand through his hair. Soon Zazie's phone rang and she picked it up. It was Yami. She handed the phone to Naruto. "Yeah? Are you okay?" she asked with worry in her voice. "Nodoka told me what happened and I couldn't get you on your phone." "We are fine," he said as they sat there. "We were just attacked by some students, but I don't know why." "I think I have an idea about that," Yami said with seriousness in her voice. "Your old friend has been busy." "Oh no," Naruto said. "Yes, it seems that our buddy Sasuke has hypnotized most of the campus," Yami said as she looked out the window. "I can see a giant Sharingan hovering the school building." Naruto looked up and activated his Shinigami vision. He saw the large red eye over the school building. "Damn," Naruto said with frustration. "What is going on?" Chachimaru asked, seeing Naruto's face. "Sasuke is making his move," Naruto said as he started to summon his weapons. "We need to end it now." Zazie and Chachimaru nodded and activated the pacts. Soon all three were ready for battle and headed towards the school. Naruto and the girls moved quickly towards the school, avoiding the groups of students patrolling the campus. They dodged them quickly and continued on their way. Suddenly a bolt of lightning sped towards the trio, making them scatter. They landed on the ground and looked up to see Negi and his partner staring down at them, eyes glassed over. "Oh, this is not good," Naruto said and dodged to the side as Negi launched another spell at the group. They split up, only for Zazie to be cut off by Asuna and Chachimaru by Setsuna. Naruto was confronted by Mana and Kid while Negi sent spells at him from afar. Zazie versus Asuna. Asuna looked at Zazie with a blank expression. "My master has ordered your death," she said and lifted her sword high in the air. Zazie dodged to the side and tried to shoot a spell, only for Asuna to press her attack, not giving her time to say the spell. Zazie flipped away and landed on a tree branch. She quickly summoned a pair of kunai in her hands. She blocked a slash from Asuna and pushed her back, trying to get some space to get time to cast. Unfortunately, Asuna wouldn't allow it. She pressed her attack once again. Zazie said, but it fell on deaf ears. She dodged another slash and finally had a time to cast a spell. She said and shot out a small red ball at Asuna and knocked her back. She hoped that it was enough to stop the girl, but Asuna got back up and charged. Zazie blocked the strike and punched Asuna in the stomach. She pushed her attack with a different combination of punches and kicks, causing more damage to her opponent, but Asuna seemed to not want to go down. She blocked one of Zazi's strikes and then slashed across Zazi's chest. Zazie felt the blade pierce her skin and she fell to the ground as blood gushed from the wound. She rolled away from an overhead strike and hid in the trees. She slowly healed the cut on her chest and hoped Asuna wouldn't find her. Asuna meanwhile was using her blade to chop down the trees looking for Zazie. "It is all over, Zazie," Asuna said. "My master will kill Naruto and you as well." Zazie shivered as she heard Asuna get closer and closer. She cut down the final tree and Asuna saw Zazie sitting there. "Found you," she said and lifted her blade over her head ready to end Zazie. Chachimaru vs Setsuna. Setsuna and Chachimaru were locked in a clash of blades. Chachimaru was struggling against the smaller girl and was thinking of what to do to push her back. "Give it up, Chachimaru," Setsuna said. "Sasuke Sama will win and destroy Naruto." Chachimaru pushed Setsuna back and activated her rockets. "I will not let that happen," Chachimaru said and charged forward, pushing Setsuna back. The soon fell into a battle of blades and Chachimaru was on the losing end. Setsuna was the better blade master and Chachimaru's armor was littered with cuts from her blade. Setsuna jumped back and sheathed her blade. She set her stance and charged Chachimaru. She drew her blade and Chachimaru felt many cuts in the matter of seconds. "Hyaka Rairan," she said and sheathed her blade. Chachimaru stood there for a moment before falling to the ground, blood seeping from many wounds. "It is over," Setsuna said and stood up, but suddenly she heard the sound of someone standing. She turned and saw Chachimaru standing up, blood seeping through her armor. "It will take more than that to take me down," Chachimaru said. She took her stance and breathed. "Engage full battle mode." A bright light suddenly surrounded her. It soon died down, revealing a fully armored Chachimaru. She wore a helmet that had her signature antenna sticking out on each side, her chest wave cover in a light blue armor that covered most of her top. Her shoulder guards were slime but had 2 small holes in each. Her arms and legs were all covered in small boosters could be seen on her back and legs. She slowly lifted off the ground and suddenly charged forward and hit Setsuna straight in the stomach. She doubled over in pain as the air was pushed out of her body. Chachimaru not want to give up her advantage and continued to attack Setsuna. She knocked her into the air and flew up before throwing her down to the ground. Setsuna hit the ground creating a small crater, but Chachimaru wasn't done. She landed over Setsuna and continued to pummel her into the ground. Setsuna fell unconscious as Chachimaru continued to attack. Chachimaru saw that Setsuna was down for the count but didn't want to leave her there to be a threat. She took some wire and tied her up and left her on top of a building. "I am sorry," she said as she looked over Setsuna's broken and battered body. She lifted off the ground and headed back towards the fight. She scanned the area and saw Zazie in trouble. She activated her boosters and sped towards his down friend. "I coming, Zazie," she said and looked over to where Naruto was fight. "My love, be safe." Zazie watched as the sword came down and rolled to the side. She pushed herself up and sent a silent shikaho at Asuna. She ran a bit to get some space. She saw Asuna heading towards her and she faded into shadows. She watched as the orange-haired girl looked around for her and tried to find her. Zazie smiled as he watched her opponent. "Come out, Zazie," Asuna said and looked around for Zazie. "Just give up, master will make your end painless." Zazie listened to Asuna and shook her head. She didn't plan on giving up and moved silently through the trees. She settled on a branch behind Asuna and put her hands together. She said and sent a large blast of yellow lightning at Asuna. Asuna heard the blast and dodged to the side. She quickly turned to see where the attack came from, but Zazie had already faded back into the background. She watched the trees and wondered where the next attack would come from. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a large red ball fly towards her. She stepped to the side, letting the ball fly past. She turned around and headed towards a clearing, wanting a better area for the fight. Zazie followed but stayed at the tree line so she could watch what Asuna did next. Asuna held her sword in front of her and closed her eyes. She didn't move for a few minutes and Zazie decided to test her defense. She sent a barrage of Shikako spells at her and watched as Asuna dodged or blocked them all. She frowned and wondered what she would do next. She wondered when she saw Chachimaru land in front of Asuna. She smiled and opened a mental link with her. She said with a smile. Chachimaru smiled. "Yes, it's good to see that you're okay as well," she replied and faced Asuna. "I distract her, you take her out from behind." Zazie nodded and watched as Asuna faced Chachimaru. It seemed that Setsuna failed, Asuna said as she looked at Chachimaru. Chachimaru nodded. "Now all that is left is you," she said and charged forward. Asuna raised her blade and blocked Chachimaru's first strike. She pushed off inside, stepped a punch to the face. Asuna span around and brought her blade down on Chachimaru, who blocked with her arm guard. Chachimaru pushed Asuna back and created some space. She activated her thrusters and charged forward. Asuna brought her blade up and blocked her charge. She held her ground, but Chachimaru was pushing her back. She tried to push her back, she didn't have the strength. She rolled to the side and got some distance from Chachimaru, only to dodge a red ball. She turned and saw Zazie standing heat the tree line, preparing to fire another spell. Damn! Asuna thought as she dodged another attack. She turned to face Zazie when she was blindsided by Chachimaru. The force of the attack sent her flying across the field. She stood up slowly, her breathing labored. She looked and was able to bring her sword up to block an attack from Chachimaru, but she was then hit with a red ball that sent her flying. Chachimaru smiled as she watched Asuna try to stand. Her breathing was hagged and she had cuts and bruises all over her body. Most of her clothes were torn, leaving her half naked and tired. Chachimaru knew that this next attack would end it and looked over to Zazie. "After my attack, trap her with your strongest binding spell," she said to her companion, who nodded. Chachimaru turned toward Asuna and took off at high speeds. Asuna watched as Chachimaru suddenly appeared before her and punched her in the stomach. She felt all the air in her body leave her as she flew back from the punch. She tried to stay conscious, but she couldn't keep her eyes open. She turned and saw Chachimaru coming towards her when she felt something wrap around her. She turned and found a glowing white chain bind her. She turned and saw Zazie standing over her hands together. She looked at the pair with a blank expression on her face before she slipped into darkness. Chachimaru watched as Asuna stopped moving and knew she was out. She picked her up and flew her to the same building she left Setsuna on. While she was gone, Zazie took the time to rest. She had nearly lost the battle and was currently trying to recharge. She let out a sigh as she leaned next to a tree. Chachimaru returned and sat down next to Zazie. "We have to find Naruto," she said, and Zazie nodded. Zazie replied and got up. She breathed in and took off into the trees. Chachimaru watched for a moment before following. With Naruto. Naruto sighed as he dodged another barrage of light arrows. He was getting annoyed by the consent barrage from the small red head. When he was separated from Zazie and Chachimaru, he tried to find them but was pinned down. Negi was on his staff, firing off barrage after barrage of magic arrows at Naruto. Naruto dodged them but had to deal with Kid and Feiku in close range. He brushed them off like it was nothing, but they kept getting in his way. He turned and blocked a kick from Feiku and knocked her to the side, only for Kid to attack him from jumped over her, only to twist in the middle of the air to dodge more arrows. Naruto turned and another kick for Feiku. Before she could create space for another attack, Naruto grabbed her leg and slammed her onto the ground. Fei felt all the air leave her body and was stunned for a moment. Naruto was about to take advantage of this when he dodged Kid's large shuriken. He spun around and grabbed it. He used the blade to block Kid's kick and then spun it around to block Fei's attack. He sent Feiku flying with the flat side of the shuriken and then threw it at Negi with all his might. The small red head quickly flew to the side, not wanting to get hit by the spinning blades. "Damn," Naruto thought as he ran forward. He was dodged Kid and continued to charge, only to be blown back by a wind spell for Negi. Naruto spun away from a kick from Feiku and blocked a punch from Kid. He was annoyed and wanted to move on. He blocked the kick from Feiku and threw her into Kid. He rushed the pair and waved his hands together. "Bakudo number 63 Seijo Sabaku," Naruto said, and a large yellow chain appeared and wrapped itself around Feiku and Kid. They tried to break out, but the chains were too strong. Naruto smiled to himself but didn't have time to relax as he dodged another barrage of attacks from the pint-sized mage. Naruto span around and brought his hand together. "Hado number 31 Shikaho," he cried and sent a large ball of red energy at Negi. The red head dodged to the side but felt the shockwave of the explosion from the attack. It sent him down towards the ground while Naruto charged forward. He jumped and grabbed Negi off his staff and brought him to the ground. He quickly bound the young mage in the same Bakudo as Kid and Feiku. As he sat down, he looked at his opponents and sighed. "Damn you, Sasuke," he said as he got up. "I will make you pay for all you have done." "Then make me pay," a voice said from behind him, and he turned and saw Sasuke standing there. "Hello, Dobi." "Teme," Naruto replied and stood up. He summoned his scythe to his hand. Sasuke lifted his sword and looked at his opponent. The wind blew for a moment, the only sound heard between the two fighters. So they became blurs and the sound of blades clashing filled the air. Naruto and Sasuke separate and look at each other once again. The soon clashed again, and all that could be seen was the blur of colors. Naruto was orange and black while Sasuke was white and black. As the combatants separated once again, they couldn't help but hide the smile on their faces. Naruto charged forward and brought his blade down in a downward slash. Sasuke spun to the left and brought his sword towards Naruto's unguarded side. Naruto blocked with the pull of his scythe and pushed off, creating space. They separated again and looked at each other. Sasuke put his sword away, his Sharingan blazing. Naruto noticed this and tensed. Sasuke went through a few hand signs before looking at Naruto. Suton. Water dragon just two. He cried, and a large dragon of water charged at Naruto. Damn. Naruto thought and dodged the side, doing his own set of hand signs. Futon, air bullets. He shouted and took a deep breath. He exhaled 5 small air bullets at Sasuke. Sasuke dodged the attack and ran forward, catching Naruto with a punch in the face. Naruto flew back a few feet before flipping in midair and landed on his feet. He blocked another punch from Sasuke and tried to punch him back. Sasuke dodged the punch and kicked Naruto in the side, sending him back a bit. Come on, Dobi, he said with a laugh. You can do better than that. Naruto looked at his former friend and frowned. Bring it, Teme, he said, and went through some hand signs. Power limiter seal. Release. He shouted, and he was covered in a bright light. As the light faded away, Sasuke could see Naruto clearly. His hair was longer, 2 wolf ears were on top of his head, whisker marks were more pronounced, and 10 flowing wolf tails were waving behind him. Sasuke looked at Naruto and frowned. Naruto suddenly appeared in front of Sasuke and sent him flying with a backhand to the face. He flew through the air only for Naruto to appear again. He punched Sasuke into the ground, and soon a huge crater was formed. Sasuke felt all the air leave his body as Naruto stood over him. Who the Dobi now? Naruto said, and formed a Rasengan in his hand and drove it into Sasuke's chest. Sasuke felt the attack grind into him, and soon there was a large gaping hole in his body. Goodbye. Soon the sky turned blue as the shadow of the Sharingan faded away. Chachimaru and Zazie reached Naruto and saw the damage that his battle has caused. They saw him standing in a creator, blood all over his left hand. He turned towards them and gave them a smile. It is all over, he said, and he walked out of the creator. Zazie rushed him and tackled him to the ground. She held him close, not wanting to let go. Chachimaru soon joined her and wrapped herself around Naruto. He stroked their hair as he stared into the sky. It over, he said with a sad smile. A few days later, Naruto had finished packing his things and looked around the room. He couldn't help but smile at all the memories he had created and was sad to be leaving. After the battle, Yami told him he needed to leave. He was sad to be going, and when he informed the girls, they were saddened. He took one last look and headed out the door. As he exited the dorms, he noticed that it was quiet. He couldn't help but sigh as he walked, knowing that it was better to just leave without any hasty goodbyes. As he reached the entrance of the dorms, he saw 4 people standing there. Chachimaru, Zazie, Nodoka, and Ayaka all stood there waiting for him. Hello, loves, he said with a smile. Are we ready? They all nodded and he smiled. Then, ladies, he said, it is time we make our leave. The group walked towards the train, leaving behind a peaceful Mahora. As class started, many people looked around for the bodyguard and the 4 missing students, but no trace of them were found. Negi entered the classroom to find a note on the desk. He saw that it was addressed to the class. Open it, Asuna said, and he nodded. He opened the letter and looked at the content inside. He was quiet for a moment before he started to read. To Class 3A, I am sorry to say goodbye like this, but I am needed elsewhere. I know our time together was short, but I will never forget the fun we had together. Thank you for letting me be with you for a time, and I hope you all will live happy lives. Sincerely, Naruto. Many of the girls were sad to see him go, but Negi wasn't done. Everyone, he said, Nodoka, Zazie, Chachimaru and Ayaka have all left the school. This made everyone look at him in shock. They say they are sorry they couldn't say goodbye in person, but they love all of you. The class was silent and couldn't believe that they had lost some friends, but they knew that they were going someplace better. 10 years later, Naruto sat in a desk going through a stack of paperwork. He had taken over the job as Yami from his mother 3 years back and couldn't help but curse under his breath. He hated the amount of paperwork he had to do and cried inwardly as he finished yet another stack. Why did I take this job? He wondered, but was interrupted when the door burst open. Daddy! A collective of voices cried, and Naruto was swarmed by a gang of small children. He fell out of his chair and looked at all the bodies that were on top of him. First there was a girl about 5 years old with silver hair, blue slitted eyes, wolf ears, and 2 tails. This was his daughter Zell. She was the first child from Zazie and himself. She smiled as she looked at her father and held him close. Next was a pair of boys, one with green hair and the other with blonde. They both sported wolf ears and tails. These were the twin Choji and Shu. Both were 4 years old and their mother was Chachimaru. Next was another girl. She had blue hair that covered her face and a book in her hand. This was Naneo. She was 5 and always loved to read. Her mother was Nodoka and he couldn't help but smile. Finally there was his youngest. She was 3 years old with long blonde hair. Her name was Yami. She smiled at her father and held him close. Her mother was Ayaka and he couldn't help but be ecstatic when she was born. "Children, get off your father," a voice said, and they all turned to see their mothers standing at the door. Over the last 10 years they have matured and Naruto couldn't help but smile. They all were beautiful and they all loved him. "It okay," he said with a smile. "I need the distraction anyway." Everyone laughed as he got up with a child in his arms and on his legs. Ayame rode on his back as he walked towards their mothers, a huge smile on his face. Life was good.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.